In a time before antibiotics, electricity, or functional plumbing, people in medieval Europe lived in a world that crackled with unseen forces. This isn't about wand-waving wizards or pointy hats, though there were some pointy hats. This is the true and tangled story of how magic wasn't just a curiosity or a crime. It was a way of understanding life, death, healing, and the weather, all while trying not to die from bread mold or a bad haircut. If you're the kind of soul who loves long, strange journeys into the dusty corners of history, subscribe, because things are about to get medieval. Life was cold, dark, and terrifying in medieval Europe if you made it past infancy. Congrats! You now had several good years of mud, pottage, and the lurking certainty that everything was either cursed, contagious. Medicine, to put it gently, was an adventure. You had a fever. That meant your hormones were off. Which, whom or, no one really knew, but a good bleeding, and perhaps a warm pigeon carcass applied to your chest might cheer you up, or at least distract you from the plague. Doctors and barbers were practically interchangeable. One would prescribe herbs, the other would drill a hole in your skull to let the demons out. Either way, you were likely to end up dizzy, poorer, and no closer to health than before. A surprising number of treatments involved animal dung, cow dung, sheep dung, goose droppings. Someone out there was playing medieval Mad Libs with your immune system. Superstition governed daily life like a tyrannical cosmic landlord. If your cow stopped giving milk, it wasn't poor feed or infection. It was clearly your weird neighbor Agnes who gave you the stink eye last Tuesday. Crops failed. Witch. Bad dreams. Witch. Stub toe. Almost certainly witch. People clung to belief like their lives depended on it, because, in many ways, it did. Nature was unpredictable. The church said suffering was holy, and bandits liked to tax you privately in the woods. So folks had to find some kind of structure that explained why the world was so thoroughly unpleasant. To the average peasant, even the church's Latin Mass might as well have been magic. The priest spoke in tongues, wore shimmering robes, waved incense, and occasionally transformed bread into flesh. Honestly, if that's not a spell, what is? Religion and magic weren't always clear-cut rivals. In fact, plenty of monks dabbled in star charts and alchemy when they weren't busy illuminating manuscripts or chastising the local population. And yet, despite how bleak and absurd life could be, people didn't just curl up and dive well. Okay, a lot did, but the rest carried on. They adapted. They reached into tradition, folklore, old Roman texts, and wild peasant theories passed down like herbal heirlooms. And from that desperate brew emerged their magic. This wasn't wand-waving fantasy. It was survival. And yet, despite how bleak and absurd life could be, people didn't just curl up and die well. Okay, a lot did. But the rest carried on. They adapted. They reached into tradition, folklore, old Roman texts, and wild peasant theories passed down like herbal heirlooms. And from that desperate brew emerged their magic. This wasn't wand-waving fantasy. It was survival. It was the old woman gathering herbs under the moonlight and muttering Latin, sounding gibberish she'd learned from her grandmother. It was the hedge witch with her mysterious ointments made of goose grease, moss, and just a whiff of superstition. It was the village wise man who could cure your sick cow by tying knots in a piece of string, while whispering insults to a turnip. None of these folks thought of themselves as magicians. They were just trying to get by without dying of infected splinters or demonic hiccups. And the people believed in them. Because when the church bells tolled and the harvest failed and your wife gave birth to a baby with too many teeth, who else was going to help? Not the local lord who was too busy justing or tax collecting. Not the travelling barber who prescribed leeches for everything up to and including heartbreak. No, you turned to the cunning folk, the charm makers, the bone readers, the people who saw the world as layered with signs and symbols, and who claimed to speak the strange language of fate. Their spells weren't fancy. Some were nothing more than folk prayers scrawled on old bits of parchment, or bundles of twigs tied in mysterious ways. Others involved burying an egg at a crossroads and spitting on it at sunrise, which, if nothing else, was a surefire way to keep your neighbours from asking to borrow sugar. But even as peasants carried out these rustic rituals, they lived in a world dominated by the church, and the line between magic and miracle was thinner than a communion wafer. If a peasant cured a fever with a charm, it was sorcery. If a priest waved a relic and the fever broke, it was divine intervention. Same effect, different PR department. Which is how we arrive at one of the most fascinating entanglements in medieval Europe: magic and religion intertwined. Relics, blessings, and holy magic. In medieval Europe, the line between divine miracle and good old-fashioned folk magic wasn't just blurry. It was practically decorative. While the church thundered from the pulpits about purity and piety, the faithful were out there, sewing amulets into their tunics and praying to Saint Apollonia to stop their toothaches. Because let's be honest, when your teeth hurt, you don't care if relief comes from heaven or hedge witch. Just make it stop. At the heart of this strange alliance between the sacred and the superstitious were relics. The charred finger bones of saints, pieces of the true cross, vials of blood that may or may not have been ketchup. These holy objects were believed to radiate divine power, like a blessed battery pack. A relic didn't just inspire reverence. It was believed to literally do things: heal the sick, repel demons, protect crops from hail, and maybe cure your mother-in-law's gout. Jury's still out on that one. Pilgrims would travel hundreds of miles through mud, bandits, and bad pies just to glimpse a saint's toenail. And if they were lucky, maybe get a scrap of cloth rubbed on it to bring home. A sort of divine party favor. Entire towns built their local economies around relics, advertising them like medieval amusement parks. Come for St. Cuthbert's spleen, stay for the miracle fountain that occasionally weeps blood. Then there were blessings, which often overlapped with the magical. Holy water. That's basically medieval Windex. It fixed everything from demons to hiccups. Priests would bless crops, cattle, homes, babies, and on rare occasion, someone's really unlucky left boot. And exorcisms. Those were full-blown mystical showdowns, featuring Latin incantations, sacred objects, and priests shouting at the devil like he owed them money. But here's where it got spicy. This church-sanctioned magic was often indistinguishable from the everyday spellcraft of common folk. The difference wasn't in what was done, it was in who did it. A priest holding up a crucifix and muttering Latin over a fevered child. Miraculous. Your grandma doing the same thing with garlic and a verse in Old English. Suspicious. Probably a witch. Burn her just to be safe. It was a theological tightrope walk. The church embraced miracles, but abhorred magic. They loved relics, but loathed charms. And yet, for the people living in the grimy, uncertain now of medieval Europe, there was no real contradiction. If it worked, it was good. If it was blessed, even better. And if it could make the cows stop dying and keep your child from turning blue in the night, well, saint, sorcerer, or suspicious peasant lady, you took the help where you could find it. People blamed spirits for everything: plague, storms, spoiled milk, and we mean everything. If anything inconvenient, unfortunate, or remotely mysterious happened between 500 and 1500 AD, someone somewhere blamed a spirit for it faster than you can say. Nomen patris. Your crops failed. A woodland sprite danced too close to your barley. Stubbed your toe. A goblin was clearly hiding under the step. Baby cried all night. Definitely a fairy switcheroo. Someone probably got accused of sorcery, just for sneezing too enthusiastically during a full moon. There was a spirit for every occasion. The patron demon of dropping your almid. Sip. The gremlin of misplaced socks. The wraith of that weird smell in the pantry. If it had a whiff of mystery or inconvenience. The medieval mind had a spectral scapegoat ready to go. No one trusted the weather. Too much rain. A storm spirit was mad. Not enough. A pagan forgot to appease the sky goblins. And thunder. Clearly God was bowling again. Or possibly using celestial flatulence to remind us who's boss. Let's talk spoiled milk, a medieval tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. You put the pail out, you say your prayers, maybe even toss a pinch of salt over your shoulder, just to cover all your bases, and still, it sours. Naturally, no one considered basic bacterial contamination. Oh no, that milk was hexed. Perhaps the cow had been given the evil eye. Or maybe your envious neighbor cursed your churn out of spite because you had more goats. Entire social feuds ignited over dairy-related malfunctions. Feeling a little gassy after dinner. Not indigestion, friend. That's a mischievous spirit trying to inflate you like a heretical balloon. Woke up with a headache. You clearly slept facing north, which everyone knows invites spectral interference. And if your bread didn't rise, that's not yeast failure. That's the spirit of old brother Dunstan the flatulent, who died bitter and carb, resentful in 1237, and has haunted ovens ever since. And don't even get me started on toothaches. That was the work of a demon, a tiny evil spirit living in your molar and gnawing at the enamel with diabolical glee. Some folks tried to smoke them out with incense. Others chanted psalms directly into their mouths. And one particularly bold soul tried to bribe the demon with a piece of bacon. Spoiler, the demon did not accept the offer. People weren't just imaginative. They were motivated. Spirits weren't spooky tales you told around a fire. They were tools for explaining the inexplicable, assigning blame where science had yet to tread. And they offered emotional relief, too. After all, it's much less terrifying to believe that your problems are the fault of a malicious tree, spirit, than to accept that nature is random. Illness is unpredictable, and your neighbor Margaret just makes better cheese than you. Of course, not all spirits were equal. Some just knocked things over and ruined your jam. But others were far more sinister. If you lived in medieval Europe and started acting a little off, say, talking to yourself, twitching uncontrollably, or developing a sudden fondness for eating mud, there was a very good chance someone would declare, "That one's got a devil in him." And just like that, congratulations! You were now the proud host of a demonic timeshare. The medieval mind didn't dabble in subtlety. There was no, maybe he's just having a rough week, or perhaps she's experiencing a neurological disorder. No, if you were behaving strangely, it was because Satan had moved into your frontal lobe and was redecorating with pitchforks and Latin curses. Mental illness? Never heard of her, but demonic possession? Oh, absolutely. That was practically a household diagnosis. People believed demons were everywhere. In the air, in your bread, in your left knee. They could sneak in through your ears, your dreams, or that one time you forgot to say grace before dinner. And once they were in, they didn't just sit quietly. No, they threw a party. A loud, chaotic, furniture-flipping party. Victims might scream, convulse, speak in tongues, or suddenly develop an uncanny ability to quote obscure scripture while levitating 3 feet off the ground. You know, classic Tuesday stuff. The church naturally had a solution: exorcism. This was less gentle spiritual guidance, and more shouting Latin while flinging holy water like a caffeinated sprinkler. Priests would interrogate the demon, demand its name because apparently demons are very polite about introductions, and then command it to leave, preferably with dramatic flair and a thunderclap. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the afflicted just got tired of being yelled at and pretended to be cured so they could go home and lie down. But not all possessions were so theatrical. Some were subtle. A woman who cried too much, possessed. A man who laughed at inappropriate times, possessed. A child who refused to eat turnips, definitely possessed. Basically, if you didn't conform to the exact behavioral expectations of your village, someone would eventually suggest that Beelzebub had taken up residence in your spleen. And let's not forget the devil's agents, witches. These were often just unfortunate women who knew too much about herbs, owned a cat, or had the audacity to age past 40 without dying. They were accused of consorting with demons, flying through the night, and causing everything from miscarriages to mildew. Trials were held. Tests were conducted. Can she float? Witch. Can she sink? Also witch. Can she recite the Lord's Prayer backwards while juggling? Definitely a witch, but also kind of impressive. The even natural disasters were blamed on demonic influence. A bad harvest. Demons. A sudden illness. Demons. Your cow giving birth to a goat-shaped calf with a suspicious glint in its eye. Demons. The world was a spiritual battlefield, and your average peasant was caught in the middle, with nothing but a wooden cross and a vague sense of dread. But not all supernatural threats were so hellish. Some were smaller, trickier, more whimsical. Fairies believed to steal children, cause illness. Ah yes, fairies. The dainty, glittery, wing-fluttering creatures of bedtime stories and Disney movies, right? WRNG. In medieval Europe, fairies were less Tinker Bell and more tiny supernatural kidnappers with a grudge and a taste for mischief. These weren't your garden variety pixies. These were beings of ancient folklore, older than the hills and twice as moody, who could bless your harvest one day and steal your baby the next, because you forgot to leave out a saucer of milk. Rude. To the medieval mind, fairies were everywhere. In the woods, in the hills, in that weird patch of mushrooms that definitely wasn't there yesterday. They were the original neighborhood watch. Except instead of reporting suspicious activity, they were the suspicious activity. And if something went wrong in your life, there was a good chance someone would whisper. The fair folk did it. And everyone else would nod solemnly while clutching their turnip charms. Let's talk about the changeling situation. This was the medieval version of a supernatural baby swap. If your child suddenly became sickly, cried constantly, or, heaven forbid, developed a personality, people believed the fairies had stolen the real baby and left behind a changeling. This changeling might look like your child, but it was actually a fairy decoy, often described as wizened, cranky, and oddly fond of beer. Yes, some tales say changelings demanded ale. Honestly, same. To test if your baby was a changeling, people would do things like cook soup in an eggshell, or pretend to leave the house and spy through the window. If the baby suddenly stood up and recited a poem in ancient Gaelic or laughed like a 90-year-old man who's seen too much, congratulations! You had yourself a fairy baby. The next step? Try to trick the fairies into taking it back. This usually involved leaving the changeling in the woods, tossing it into a river, lakes, or baking bread in a very specific way while chanting something that sounded suspiciously like a recipe for disaster. And it wasn't just babies. Fairies were blamed for illnesses too. Got a fever, fairy dart, atching joints, fairy curse. Woke up with a mysterious bruise. You were probably fairy-ridden in the night, which is exactly as uncomfortable as it sounds. Some folks believed fairies would ride humans, like horses while they slept, leaving them exhausted and sore in the morning. So honestly, that explains a lot about Mondays. To protect themselves, people carried iron charms, wore their clothes inside out, or avoided whistling after dark. Because apparently, that was like ringing the fairy dinner bell. Offerings were left at fairy mounds, crossroads, and wells. bread, milk, shiny trinkets, basically anything that said, "Please don't hex me. I'm just trying to survive the 14th century." And God help you if you built your house on a fairy path. That was like constructing a bungalow on a ghost highway. Your livestock would die, your crops would fail, and your furniture would rearrange itself in passive-aggressive protest. The only solution: knock down a wall, build a fairy door, and hope the little gremlins appreciated your open, concept living space. But while fairies were mischievous and unpredictable, they were still part of the natural order. They were the wild card in the medieval deck. The real terror came from those who chose to wield supernatural power. Which brings us to the next chapter in this magical mess. Witches and sorcerers, accused of cursing livestock and crops. If your cow stopped giving milk in medieval Europe, it wasn't because she was old, sick, or just emotionally exhausted from being a medieval cow. No, clearly someone had cursed her. Probably that suspicious widow down the lane with the one eye, and the herb garden that smelled a little too effective. And if your crops failed, it wasn't poor soil drought, or the fact that you planted turnips upside down. It was witchcraft, obviously. Someone had hexed your barley, and now your porridge was ruined, and your soul was probably next. Witches and sorcerers were the medieval equivalent of tech support. If something broke, and no one knew why, blame the person who looked like they might understand how it worked. They were accused of everything from souring butter, to summoning hailstorms, to making your sheep walk in circles, until they dropped dead from confusion. And God help you if your neighbor's pig got sick after you gave her a funny look. Next thing you know, you're being dunked in a river to see if you float like a witch or sink like a slightly damp peasant. The accusations were often delightfully specific. She looked at my cow and it fell over. He muttered something near my wheat, and now it's full of worms. She sneezed 3 times during the harvest moon, and now my chickens won't lay eggs unless I sing to them in Latin. These were not vague suspicions. These were scientific observations, backed by the unimpeachable authority of gossip and fear. And the evidence? Oh, it was airtight. Did the accused have a mole? Witch's mark. Did they own a cat? Familiar. Did they talk to themselves while gardening, clearly communing with dark forces? Did they live alone, read books, or, God forbid, know how to make a poultice? Burn them immediately. Sometimes the accused were even blamed for weather. A sudden frost in June. Witch? A thunderstorm during haymaking. Sorcerer? A light drizzle that made your hair frizz. Definitely the work of someone who once refused to lend you a turnip. And if you dared to be helpful, say, by healing someone with herbs or predicting a storm, you were just asking to be accused. Because in medieval logic, if you could fix it, you probably broke it in the first place. Trials were held, of course, but they were less justice and more community theatre with torches. The accused might be forced to recite prayers backward, walk barefoot over hot coals, or be pricked with needles to find the devil's spot, a numb patch of skin that proved you were in league with Satan. Spoiler. Everyone has one if you poke them long enough. And if you confessed, well, that just proved you were guilty. If you didn't confess, that proved you were really guilty. It was a lose-lose situation, unless you were the local inquisitor, in which case it was a great day for job security. But not all supernatural scapegoats were so adult. Some were smaller, trickier, more nocturnal. Elves and goblins blamed for nightmares. In the medieval imagination, bedtime wasn't a peaceful descent into dreams. It was a nightly gamble with the supernatural. You didn't just tuck yourself in and drift off. No, you braced for impact. Because once the candles were out and the fire dimmed, that's when the little ones came out. And not the cute kind with jingling bells and cookie recipes. We're talking about elves and goblins. the original sleep paralysis demons, with a flair for drama and a deep-seated grudge against rammed cycles. These creatures were blamed for nightmares, and not just the "foops, I forgot my pants at school" kind. We're talking full-blown, chest-crushing, soul-squeezing, wake-up, screaming into your hay pillow kind of nightmares. The kind where you wake up convinced your goat is plotting against you, and your left foot is cursed. The German word for nightmare, Albtraum, literally means wolf dream. That's right. Elves were so notorious for messing with people's sleep that they got their own etymological shout-out. According to folklore, these weren't your Tolkien-style elves with flowing hair and tragic backstories. These were dark elves, or albs, who would sneak into your room at night, perch on your chest like a judgmental cat, and proceed to give you the worst dreams imaginable. And they didn't even bring snacks. Goblins weren't much better. These little gremlins were the medieval version of that one cousin who shows up uninvited, eats all your food, and then blames you when the furniture's on fire. They were blamed for everything from tangled hair, known as self-locks, to sleepwalking, to waking up with mysterious bruises, and the vague sense that someone had been poking you with a stick all night. Which, to be fair, they probably had. And God help you if you snored. That was practically an invitation. Come sit on my chest and whisper eldritch riddles into my dreams. Your nasal passages seem to say. People believed that these creatures would ride you like a horse in your sleep. Yes, ride you, leaving you exhausted, confused, and possibly neighing by morning. To ward them off, people tried everything. Sleeping with a Bible under the pillow, drawing protective symbols on the bedposts, sleeping with one eye open and a dagger under the mattress, which, frankly, seems like a bigger hazard than the goblins. Some even tried bribery, leaving out bread, milk, or shiny trinkets in hopes the creatures would take the offering and go bother someone else, preferably that guy down the road, who never returned your wheelbarrow. But the most tried and true method, the one that really said, "Not today, goblin scum," hanging iron over cradles to keep fairies away. In medieval Europe, if you had a newborn baby, you didn't just swaddle it in linen and hope for the best. No, you armed that cradle like it was a fortress under siege. Because lurking just beyond the edge of the hearth fire, in the shadows of the thatched roof, were the fairies. Those sneaky, baby-snatching, mischief-loving creatures who apparently had a taste for fresh infants and zero respect for personal boundaries. And so, what did people do? They reached for the most powerful anti-fairy weapon known to man, iron. Not silver, not garlic bread, not a strongly worded letter, iron, specifically cold iron, which was believed to be the fairy equivalent of a restraining order and a slap in the face rolled into one. Parents would hang iron scissors over the cradle, blades open like a tiny medieval security system. Some would place iron nails in the bedposts, tuck iron keys under the mattress, or even wedge a horseshoe above the door for extra anti-fey flair. If you were really serious, you might just build the entire crib out of iron and hope your baby didn't develop tetanus before the fairies gave up. Why iron? No one really knew. Maybe it was because iron was forged in fire and thus symbolically powerful. Maybe it was because fairies were allergic to metallurgy. Or maybe it was just because iron was heavy and pointy and made people feel better. Either way, it worked. At least in the minds of terrified parents who didn't want their baby replaced with a changeling that screamed in Latin and demanded Al. And it wasn't just babies. Iron was used to protect everything. People would hammer nails into door frames, carry iron knives in their belts, and even sleep with iron under their pillows. One particularly paranoid farmer reportedly wore an iron belt buckle, iron toe rings, and carried an iron spoon at all times. He was never bothered by fairies, but he did develop a permanent lean to the left. The logic was simple: fairies hated iron. It disrupted their magic, burned their fingers, and probably clashed with their woodland aesthetic. So if you wanted to keep your child from being spirited away to dance eternally in a mushroom circle, you didn't need a priest. You needed a blacksmith. But iron wasn't the only line of defense. For those who couldn't afford a full medieval home depot setup, there was another option, one that smelled stronger and grew in your garden. In medieval Europe, if you weren't wearing at least one herb like a fashion statement, and a spiritual insurance policy, were you even trying to survive? Forget perfume. What you needed was a pungent, leafy force field to keep the forces of darkness and possibly your in-laws at bay. And leading the charge in this botanical battalion were two MVPs, rue and garlic. Let's start with rue, also known as the herb of grace, which sounds lovely until you realize it was mostly used to keep demons, witches, and nosy neighbors away. Rue was believed to be so powerful that even looking at it could make a spirit think twice. People carried sprigs of it in their pockets, tucked it into their hats, or wore it around their necks like a medieval version of a garlic scented friendship bracelet. Some even rubbed it on their skin, which, given its strong smell and mild toxicity, probably kept everyone away, evil or otherwise. Rue was also planted around homes, churches, and graveyards like a leafy, no trespassing, sign for the supernatural. If your garden didn't reek of rue, were you even protected? And if you were feeling extra cautious, you could boil it into a tea, sprinkle it around your house, or wave it dramatically at suspicious-looking clouds. It was the Swiss Army knife of spiritual defense. If the Swiss Army was really into herbal paranoia, then there was garlic, the original breath mint of the damned. Garlic wasn't just for seasoning your stew. It was your first line of defense against everything from vampires to demons to that one guy in the village who always smelled like wet wool and bad decisions. People wore garlic around their necks, hung it in doorways, and even braided it into their hair. If you smelled like a walking soup pot, congratulations, you were spiritually fortified. Garlic was believed to have the power to repel evil with its sheer olfactory aggression. Spirits, witches, and other malevolent entities were thought to be so offended by its stench that they'd flee in disgust. Honestly, it's hard to imagine a demon trying to possess someone who smells like an over-seasoned casserole. Even the devil himself was said to wrinkle his nose and move on. And it wasn't just about carrying these herbs, it was about how you carried them. You could tuck them into a leather pouch, sew them into your clothing, or stuff them into your shoes for that extra I'm protected and slightly crunchy vibe. Some folks even created elaborate herbal amulets, combining rue, garlic, and other protective plants like sage, rosemary, and whatever else they had lying around that didn't smell like despair. Of course, there were rules. You had to gather the herbs at the right time, preferably under a full moon, while chanting something vaguely Latin and avoiding eye contact with any passing goats. And God help you if you picked rue with your left hand on a Tuesday. That was just asking for trouble. But for all the ritual and superstition, these herbs gave people a sense of control in a world that was otherwise wildly unpredictable. When plagues, curses, and demonic possession were all on the menu, a little garlic in your pocket felt like a reasonable precaution. Plus, it kept your enemies at arm's length, mostly because they didn't want to stand downwind. Still, herbs weren't the only tools in the medieval spiritual toolkit. When things got really dicey, when the shadows grew long and the milk curdled just a little too fast, people turned to the heavy hitters of homegrown protection, using bread, salt, and iron nails, the holy trinity of "please don't haunt my house." Let's start with bread. the carb-based cornerstone of medieval life. Bread wasn't just food, it was sacred. It was blessed, it was shared, and in times of supernatural crisis, it was weaponized. People would hang pieces of bread in doorways, bury them at the edge of their property, or even carry stale crusts in their pockets, like glutinous talismans. If your neighbor was walking around with a baguette necklace, don't laugh. He was just trying not to get cursed by a passing spirit with a grudge and a flair for drama. And not just any bread would do. It had to be blessed bread, ideally from a church service, preferably not nibbled by mice. Some folks believed that if you placed a piece of holy bread under your pillow, it would protect you from nightmares, demons, and the temptation to eat a midnight snack. Others swore that crumbling it into your soup would purify the meal and possibly your soul. The soup, however, would be ruined. But then there was salt, the medieval equivalent of duct tape, for spiritual emergencies. Salt was believed to be pure, incorruptible, and deeply offensive to evil spirits. Sprinkle it across your threshold. No demon shall pass. Toss it over your shoulder. You just blinded a ghost. Draw a circle of it around your bed. Congratulations, you now sleep in a crunchy, sacred donut of safety. Salt was used in everything from baptismal rites to exorcisms to "please don't hex my goat" rituals. People would mix it with water to create holy brine, scatter it in corners to trap spirits, or carry little pouches of it like spicy spiritual pepper spray. And God help you if you spilled it, because that was a sign of bad luck, betrayal, or that someone nearby was definitely a witch. So bonus points if they also had a cat. And finally, iron nails, the medieval version of don't even think about it. Iron was believed to be the ultimate anti-magic metal. It was strong, it was forged in fire, and it made spirits recoil, like they'd just seen someone wear sandals with socks. People would hammer iron nails into door frames, window sills, and even the corners of their fields to keep evil at bay. Some buried them under their homes. Others carried them in their pockets. One particularly cautious monk reportedly wore a chainmail undershirt made entirely of iron nails. He was very safe, and very loud when he walked. Iron nails were also used in more creative ways. Want to trap a spirit? Nail a horseshoe above your door. Want to stop a witch from entering your barn? Nail a cross into the threshold. Want to make sure your baby doesn't get swapped by fairies? Nail a charm to the cradle and hope the fairies respect basic carpentry. Together, bread, salt, and iron nails formed a kind of medieval starter pack for spiritual survival. They were cheap, accessible, and, most importantly, believable. Because when your cow starts mooing in Latin and your butter churn explodes for no reason, you don't ask questions. You grab a loaf, a pinch, and a nail, and you get to work. But even with all that, people didn't stop there. Because when you're living in a world where demons might be hiding in your laundry and fairies are eyeing your baby like it's a limited edition collectible, you take no chances. Which brings us to the next line of defense: whispering prayers over water before drinking. Now, in the modern world, when you pour yourself a glass of water, you might think hydration. In medieval Europe, you thought, is this cursed? Because water wasn't just water, it was a potential spiritual minefield. That stream behind your cottage could be blessed, could be haunted, could be the favorite bathing spot of a water sprite with anger issues. You just didn't know. So naturally, before taking a sip, you whispered a prayer over it, just in case. This wasn't a casual cheers or a polite thank you. This was a full-on whispered negotiation with the unseen forces of the universe. Something like, "Dear Lord, please let this water quench my thirst and not my soul. Amen." And if you were really worried, you might throw in a Latin phrase or two, because nothing scares off demons like mispronounced ecclesiastical Latin muttered over a wooden cup. People believed that water could carry blessings or curses, depending on where it came from, who touched it, and whether or not a goat had recently sneezed in it. Wells were sacred. Springs were magical. Rainwater collected on a holy day. That was basically liquid armor. But water from a suspicious puddle near the gallows. You'd better pray over that like your life depended on it. Because it probably did. And don't think this was just a peasant thing. Nobles did it too. Kings had chaplains bless their bathwater. Monks whispered prayers over their soup bowls. Even knights, those armored tanks of chivalry, would pause before drinking from a stream on campaign to murmur a quick, "Please don't let this be fairy pee," under their breath. There were even special prayers for different kinds of water. One for healing, one for protection, one for making sure your oil didn't turn sour, which, frankly, should have been a national emergency. Some folks believed that if you whispered the right words, the water would glow faintly or ripple in approval. Others claimed it would taste sweeter. A few said it would whisper back. Those people were politely avoided. And if you forgot to pray, well, God help you. You might wake up with a rash shaped like a goat, or start speaking in rhymes. Or worse, your bread wouldn't rise. In a world where yeast was basically black magic, that was a fate worse than death. But here's the thing, whispering prayers over water wasn't just about superstition. It was about control. In a world full of chaos, disease, and mysterious nighttime noises, it gave people a sense of agency. A way to say, I may not understand the cosmos, but I can at least spiritually sanitize my beverage. And if the water still made you sick, well, clearly you didn't whisper hard enough. But when prayers and herbs and iron nails weren't enough, when the cow was still sick, the baby still cried, and the bread still refused to rise, people turned to the real experts. The ones who knew the old ways. The ones who didn't need Latin, or incense, or a bishop's blessing. Local witches and cunning folk were healers and charm makers. In medieval Europe, if your cow was sick, your child had a fever, and your bread refused to rise no matter how many times you yelled at it, you didn't call a doctor's, because he'd probably just bleed you and suggest leeches. No, you went to the cunning folk, the village's unofficial therapist, pharmacist, meteorologist, and part-time exorcist, all rolled into one slightly mysterious person who smelled faintly of rosemary and goat. These weren't witches in the broomstick and black cat scents, though cats were often involved, mostly for warmth and judgmental stares. They were wise women and men, known for their knowledge of herbs, charms, and the kind of whispered wisdom that made the church nervous and the neighbors very interested. They were called by many names: wise women, wise men, charmers, pellers, or simply the one who knows things. And they did know things, like how to stop a nosebleed with a chant, how to cure warts with a potato, and how to make your neighbor's cow stop staring at you funny. Cunning folk were the community's go-to problem solvers. Got a rash, they had a salve. Lost something, they'd scry it in a bowl of water. Suspect your neighbor hexed your turnips, they'd whip up a counter, curse involving salt, spit, and a very specific kind of knot. They were part healer, part detective, part spiritual bouncer. And they weren't just tolerated, they were valued. People might whisper about them behind their backs. She talks to her cat like it's her husband. But when trouble came knocking, those same people were first in line with a chicken and a desperate look. Even local authorities sometimes consulted cunning folk. Quietly, of course, because when your crops are failing and your wife's been speaking in tongues since Tuesday, you don't care if the solution involves herbs or heresy. Their tools were humble but potent bundles of dried plants, carved wooden charms, bits of parchment with protective verses, and a deep, inherited knowledge of what worked and what didn't. They knew which herbs to boil, which to burn, and which to bury under the threshold during a full moon while humming a hymn backward. Their remedies were a blend of the practical and the mystical, the botanical and the biblical. But their power wasn't just in their ingredients. It was in their presence. They listened. They watched. They remembered. They knew who had quarreled with whom, which families had a history of bad luck, and which ailments were more spiritual than physical. They were the keepers of communal memory, the living libraries of folk wisdom, and the unofficial therapists of a world that didn't believe in therapy. Of course, this made them dangerous in the eyes of the church. Too much knowledge, too much influence, too many people whispering, "She cured my baby." And so, many cunning folk walked a fine line, offering their services while avoiding the dreaded label of witch. Some succeeded. Others, tragically, did not. Still, they endured. Because when your child is burning with fever and the priest is busy debating theology, you don't care if the cure comes from a saint or a woman with a crow on her shoulder and a suspiciously accurate weather prediction. And what did these cunning folk use to work their wonders? Herbal remedies mixed with prayers and magical chants. In medieval Europe, medicine was less science-based treatment and more botanical improv theatre with a side of divine intervention. If you were sick, you didn't just get a prescription, you got a performance. A healing session might involve a bundle of herbs, a whispered prayer, a chant in half Latin, half guesswork, and possibly a chicken feather waved dramatically over your head. And somehow, this was still considered more trustworthy than the local barber, surgeon. Herbs were the backbone of medieval healing, not because they were always effective, though some were, but because they were accessible. You didn't need a degree. You needed a garden, a bit of folklore, and the confidence to say, "This will cure your boils," while holding a sprig of yarrow like it owed you money. Every village had someone who knew which plants to boil, which to burn, and which to rub on your feet while reciting Psalm 23 backward. But herbs alone weren't enough. No, you had to activate them. And that's where the prayers and magical chants came in. Because in the medieval worldview, illness wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. A fever might be caused by bad air, sure, but it could also be the result of a curse, a demon, or that time you skipped mass to go flirt with the baker's apprentice. So you didn't just treat the body, you treated the soul, the vibes, and the invisible forces lurking in your soup. Take St. John's wort, for example. Today it's known for its antidepressant properties. Back then, it was used to ward off evil spirits, heal wounds, and possibly make your neighbor's goat stop glaring at you. But only if you picked it on Midsummer's Eve, while facing east and chanting something like Herba Sancti Johannes, protect me from the night's foul breath. Bonus points if you did it barefoot and slightly terrified. Or mugwort, the Swiss Army knife of medieval witchy wellness. It was used for everything from digestive issues to prophetic dreams. But again, it wasn't just about the plant. It was about the ritual. You might boil it into a tea, while chanting a charm passed down from your grandmother, who got it from her grandmother, who probably got it from a Roman who was just winging it. And let's not forget garlic, the medieval MVP. It was eaten worn, hung in doorways, and rubbed on wounds. But for maximum effect, it had to be blessed, or at least accompanied by a muttered prayer to Saint Sebastian, patron saint of not dying horribly. Some healers would even sing to the garlic as they prepared it, because apparently garlic responds well to compliments and Gregorian melodies. The chants themselves were a glorious mess of languages and logic. Some were Christian prayers, with a few extra syllables thrown in for flair. Others were pagan incantations that had been Christianized by adding a saint's name and crossing yourself aggressively. And some were just sounds. Rhythmic, repetitive, vaguely threatening sounds that made you feel like something was happening. Even if that something was just your healer, humming into a bowl of nettle soup. These rituals weren't just superstition. They were community theatre with stakes. The healer would light candles, sprinkle herbs, chant over the afflicted, and maybe draw a protective symbol in the dirt. The patient would lie there, sweating and hopeful, while the healer waved a bundle of dried sage, like they were trying to exorcise a sneeze. And when it was over, everyone felt better. Not necessarily cured, but better. Because someone had done something. And in a world where most things were out of your control, that meant everything. Of course, timing mattered too. You couldn't just chant willy-nilly. The moon had to be right. The stars had to be aligned. The wind had to be blowing from the correct direction. And ideally, no one in the village had recently insulted a saint. Because if you really wanted your herbs and chants to work, you had to consult the cosmic calendar. Which brings us to the next magical layer of medieval life, using astrology to decide when to plant crops or heal wounds. In medieval Europe, the stars weren't just twinkling decorations in the night sky. They were the original scheduling app. Before Google Calendar, before farmers' almanacs, before anyone had even invented the concept of weekends, people looked up and said, the moon's in Virgo. Better not prune the turnips today. Astrology wasn't a hobby. It was a strategy. And if you ignored it, God help your cabbages. Let's start with planting crops. Medieval farmers didn't just throw seeds into the dirt and hope for the best. No, they consulted the heavens. The moon's phases were crucial: waxing moon for planting, waning moon for weeding, full moon for dramatic monologues in the cabbage patch. But it didn't stop there. Each zodiac sign was believed to influence different parts of the plant. Want strong roots? Plant when the moon is in Taurus. Want leafy greens? Wait for Cancer. Want your tomatoes to taste like betrayal and regret? Plant during Scorpio. Just kidding. Sort of. The zodiac signs were grouped by element: earth, air, fire, and water, and each element had its own gardening vibe. Earth signs, Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn, were great for planting and transplanting. Water signs, Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces, were ideal for leafy growth and juicy fruits. Fire signs, Aries, Leo, Sagittarius, were better for pest control and burning things, which, let's be honest, was a favorite medieval pastime. Air signs, Gemini, Libra, Aquarius, best for harvesting and drying herbs, because nothing says spiritual balance like hanging thyme from your rafters while Mercury retrogrades. And then there was healing. If you had a wound, you didn't just slap on a poultice and call it a day. You checked the stars. Was the moon in a barren sign? Good, less bleeding. Was Mars in a bad mood? Maybe wait a day, unless you wanted your surgery to turn into a bloodletting performance art piece. Medieval medical texts were full of charts showing which zodiac signs ruled which body parts. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, and so on down to Pisces, which governed the feet and, presumably, your ability to dance without summoning a demon. So if you had a toothache, you didn't just yank it out. You waited until the moon wasn't in Aries, head, or Taurus, neck, because that would draw the humors upward and possibly cause your soul to leak out through your ears. If you needed to lance a boil on your leg, you avoided Sagittarius, thighs, and Capricorn, knees, unless you wanted to anger the planetary spirits and end up with a limp and a reputation. Which brings us to the next glittering corner of medieval magic: selling love charms and protective amulets. Ah yes, the medieval marketplace, where you could buy a turnip, a chicken, and a potion to make your crush fall in love with you, all from the same stall. If you wandered through a bustling town square in the 13th century, you'd find merchants hawking everything from dried fish to guaranteed love charms, often with the same level of confidence and about the same refund policy, which is to say none. Love charms were big business. Because let's face it, romance in medieval Europe was a bit of a mess. Marriages were arranged, courtship was a minefield of social rules, and bathing was optional. So if you were a lovesick peasant with a crush on the blacksmith's daughter, you didn't write poetry. You bought a charm. Maybe it was a pouch of herbs tied with red thread. Maybe it was a carved wooden heart, soaked in rosewater and desperation. Maybe it was a suspiciously sticky scroll with a Latin phrase that translated roughly to, "Please notice me. I'm emotionally available and own 2 goats." These charms were often sold by cunning folk or traveling peddlers who claimed to have learned the art in the East, or received it from a dying monk with a mysterious accent. The ingredients were always a little vague. Essence of Venus, pondered moonbeam, or of a virgin goat. But the promise were clearly the man of the East. Wear this, carry this, bury this under your beloved's doorstep, and they'll be yours. Or at least mildly curious. And if love wasn't your concern, there were protective amulets for everything else. Amulets to ward off illness, bad luck, evil eyes, and that one guy in the village who always smelled like onions and doom. These could be made of metal, bone, stone, or even bread. Yes, bread again. It was the duct tape of medieval magic. Some were inscribed with crosses, others with runes, and a few with symbols that looked suspiciously like someone sneezed while writing. People wore them around their necks, tied them to their belts, hid them in their shoes, or sewed them into their clothes. One popular charm was a tiny bag filled with salt, rosemary, and a scrap of parchment bearing the name of a saint. Another was a coin that had been blessed, cursed, or possibly just dropped in a holy well and fished out by someone with entrepreneurial spirit. And let's not forget the multi-purpose amulet, the Swiss Army knife of spiritual protection. It promised to keep away demons, attract wealth, improve digestion, and make your neighbor's chickens mysteriously less productive. Did it work? Who knows? But it made people feel safer, and in a world full of plague, war, and suspicious cheese, that counted for a lot. Of course, the church had opinions about all this. Officially, selling charms was frowned upon. Unless, of course, the charm was a relic, a blessed medal or a piece of the true cross. Available in bulk, apparently. But for the average person, the line between sacred and superstitious was blurrier than a monk's handwriting after 3 cups of mead. Still, whether you were trying to win a heart, ward off a curse, or just make it through the week without being hexed, there was a charm for that. And if it didn't work, well, maybe Mercury was in retrograde. Or maybe you just needed to bleed a little, using leeches while reciting prayers for spiritual healing. In medieval Europe, leeches weren't just slimy little freeloaders with a taste for ankles. They were considered sacred tools of divine restoration. These squishy creatures were believed to possess not only medicinal properties, but also spiritual significance. And so, when someone fell ill, it wasn't uncommon for a healer to gently place a leech on the afflicted area while murmuring a prayer that sounded like a cross between a psalm and a very polite threat to the devil. The logic was simple if your body was out of balance. It wasn't just a physical issue. It was a spiritual one. Maybe you'd angered a saint. Maybe a fairy had sneezed on your soup. Maybe your humors were throwing a tantrum. Whatever the cause, the solution was to invite divine intervention while letting nature's little vacuum cleaners do their thing. Healers would often begin by lighting a candle, sprinkling a bit of holy water, and then selecting a leech with the same reverence one might reserve for choosing a fine wine. The leech would be placed with care, and then the healer would begin to pray aloud, invoking saints, angels, as the leech latched on with the enthusiasm of a monk at a mead tasting. Some healers even believed that the leech could absorb not just illness, but sin. That's right. These little wrigglers were seen as spiritual janitors, sucking out not only bad humors, but also bad decisions. Had a few too many impure thoughts. Lied about how many eggs your chicken laid. There's a leech for that. Just slap it on, say a prayer, and hope it doesn't crawl into your boot afterward. And of course, the prayers themselves were often customized. A healer might recite the Lord's Prayer, a psalm, or a local charm passed down through generations. Some even sang hymns softly, believing the vibrations would soothe both patient and parasite. It was a full sensory experience, part spa day, part exorcism, part nature documentary. Leeches were also associated with renewal, just as they drew out the bad. They were thought to make space for the good. After a session, the patient was expected to rest, reflect, and maybe eat something bland, while contemplating their sins, and the fact that a worm had just done more for them than their cousin Gregory the monk ever had. But if leeches weren't enough, if your ailment was particularly stubborn, or if you were dealing with something that smelled vaguely of witchcraft, then it was time to bring out the big guns. The ingredients that made even the bravest apothecary raise an eyebrow. Next up in the medieval medicine cabinet, frog hearts, owl feathers, and pigeon blood in cures. The medieval medicine cabinet, where logic went to die and frogs went to donate organs. If you thought herbs and leeches were the weirdest things people used to treat illness in medieval Europe, buckle up. Because once the rosemary ran out and the prayers stopped working, folks turned to the next best thing, animal bits. And not just any bits, the weirdest, squishiest, most questionably acquired bits imaginable. Let's start with frog hearts. These were considered potent magical ingredients, especially when dried, powdered, and sprinkled into potions or tucked into amulets. Why the heart? Because it was believed to be the seat of life, emotion, and possibly frog-based wisdom. A frog's heart, still warm, was sometimes pressed against a wart to draw out the poison. Other times, it was worn in a pouch around the neck to ward off evil spirits, bad dreams, and nosy neighbors. If you were really unlucky, someone might try to cure your fever by making you eat one, raw, with a chant, while standing on one leg. The one-legged part is optional, but it adds flair. Then there were owl feathers, which were basically the medieval version of a prescription pad. If your doctor was also a wizard and slightly unhinged, owls were seen as mysterious, nocturnal, and deeply connected to the spirit world. Their feathers were used in spells to enhance wisdom, induce visions, or, more commonly, treat madness. That's right, if you were hearing voices or talking to your turnips, someone might wave an owl feather over your head while chanting a psalm and muttering about lunar alignments. In some cases, owl feathers were burned and the ashes mixed into wine. This was supposed to calm the mind. In reality, it probably just made you cough and question your life choices. And then we have pigeon blood, because nothing says healing like the bodily fluids of a confused city bird. Pigeon blood was believed to have purifying properties. It was used in ointments, smeared on wounds, and occasionally dripped into the ears to cure deafness. Spoiler: it didn't work. Some healers claimed that pigeon blood could draw out bad humors, or even break curses. Others just liked the color. Either way, pigeons were not thrilled about this arrangement. In more elaborate rituals, all three ingredients, frog hearts, owl feathers, and pigeon blood, might be combined into a single potion or charm. This was the medieval equivalent of a nuclear option. You'd grind the heart, burn the feather, mix it with the blood, and then either drink it, bury it, or rub it on your forehead while reciting a prayer that sounded suspiciously like a recipe for summoning regret. These concoctions were used to treat everything from epilepsy to demonic possession to general malaise, which was medieval for "I feel weird and I don't like it, and God help you if you were the village pigeon keeper." You'd wake up one morning to find your coop empty and your neighbor looking suspiciously healthy. But when even the most exotic animal parts failed, when the frog hearts flopped, the owl feathers fizzled, and the pigeon blood just made things worse, people turned to something even stranger. Something that involved bodily fluids, rusty nails, and a deep, burning desire for revenge. Which brings us to the next chapter in this magical messy using witch bottles, with nails, urine, and hair buried to counter curses. The medieval DI curse, reversal kit: 1 part superstition, 2 parts bodily fluids, and a generous sprinkle of rusty hardware. If you lived in 17th century Europe and suspected that someone had hexed you, maybe your bread kept collapsing, your cow was giving sideways milk, or your joints creaked like a haunted door, you didn't just shrug and say, "Well, that's life." No, you made a witch bottle. These weren't your average decorative glass jars filled with lavender and regret. Witch bottles were serious business, crafted with the precision of a paranoid alchemist and the flair of a very determined hoarder. They were designed to trap torment and ultimately repel the witch who had cursed you. The ingredients? A delightful cocktail of urine, hair, fingernail clippings, bent nails, pins, and sometimes even bits of leather or heart-shaped fabric. Because nothing says, "Get out of my life," like a symbolic voodoo Valentine stuffed in a jug. The urine was key. It linked the bottle to the victim, creating a sympathetic magical connection. The idea was that by sealing your bodily essence inside the bottle along with sharp, painful objects, you'd create a kind of magical bear trap. The witch who cursed you would feel the torment every time she tried to pass water, which, in theory, would make her so uncomfortable she'd lift the curse just to get some bladder relief. It was medieval revenge magic at its most urological. The nails and pins weren't just for show. They were meant to stab, poke, and generally annoy the spiritual essence of the witch. Some bottles even included brimstone, sulfured, for that extra hellish kick, or ashes and soot to confuse the spirit and make it feel like it had wandered into a chimney-themed escape room. Occasionally, people added coins or teeth, because why not? If you're already peeing in a bottle and burying it under your hearth, you might as well go full chaos wizard. And where did you put this magical Molotov cocktail? Buried under the hearth, of course. Or sometimes in the garden, under the threshold, or near a riverbank, anywhere the witch might metaphorically trip over it. The warmth of the hearth was believed to activate the bottle like a spiritual crockpot, slowly cooking your curse into oblivion. Some folks even boiled the bottle, which often resulted in a loud bang and a ruined kitchen. But hey, if it exploded, that meant the curse was broken, or your house was now haunted by angry pottery shards. These bottles weren't just rural oddities. They've been found in urban homes, churches, and even castles, suggesting that fear of witchcraft transcended class, education, and access to better hobbies. And while the church officially frowned on such folk practices, many clergy quietly looked the other way, especially if their own turnips had recently gone limp. But the most fascinating part, these bottles were often made by cunning folk, the same local healers and charm makers who were sometimes accused of witchcraft themselves. It was a delicate dance: help your neighbor break a curse, but don't be too good at it, or you might end up on the wrong end of a torch-wielding mob. And speaking of mobs, witch trials driven by failed crops, bad weather, or sudden deaths In medieval Europe, if your wheat withered, your cow exploded, or your uncle dropped dead after sneezing 3 times in a row, someone was getting accused of witchcraft. Because clearly, the only logical explanation for misfortune was that your neighbor, Gertrude, had made a pact with Satan in exchange for the power to ruin your barley. Witch trials didn't just pop up out of nowhere. They were the result of fear, desperation, and a complete lack of meteorology. When crops failed, people didn't blame soil exhaustion or poor irrigation. They blamed witches. When hailstorms flattened fields, it wasn't a freak weather event. It was weather magic, obviously conjured by someone who once gave the priest a funny look during Mass. And God help you if you were a woman over 40 with a mole, a cat, or an opinion. The late 16th and early 17th centuries saw a spike in witch trials that coincided with the Little Ice Age, a period of colder than usual climate that led to widespread crop failures and famine. People were cold, hungry, and very much in the mood to blame someone. Enter the witch. She was the perfect scapegoat, visible, vulnerable, and conveniently unable to defend herself once the mob got going. In places like Wiesensteig, Germany, of 1562, hailstorms destroyed crops, and within weeks, dozens of women were accused of summoning the storms with unholy ointments and suspiciously rhythmic dancing. In Trier 1581-1593, a series of poor harvests led to over 300 executions, as authorities scrambled to explain why the grain kept dying and the goats kept looking nervous. And it wasn't just the weather. Sudden deaths, especially of children, were often blamed on witches. If a baby died in its sleep, it wasn't Sidis, it was sorcery. If a man dropped dead in the field, it wasn't a heart attack, it was a hex. If someone tripped over a rock and broke their leg, well, clearly someone had cursed the path. Probably Agnes. She always did walk a little too confidently for someone with only one eyebrow. The trials themselves were a mix of theatre, theology, and pure chaos. Accusations were often based on dreams, rumours, or livestock behaviour. My cow looked at her and then stopped producing milk. I saw her talking to a bird. She sneezed during a thunderstorm. These were actual pieces of evidence. And once accused, the odds of proving your innocence were about the same as finding a unicorn in your pantry. Torture was used liberally to extract confessions, because nothing says justice like asking someone if they consorted with the devil while stretching them like medieval taffy, and if they confessed, guilty. If they didn't, torture harder. Still didn't confess. Clearly the devil was protecting them, also guilty. The church and local authorities often encouraged these trials, not necessarily because they believed in witches, but because it was a convenient way to exert control, eliminate dissent, and occasionally seize property. Nothing says divine justice, like burning someone and then inheriting their goat. But the accusations weren't always about storms and spoiled milk. Sometimes they got a little more personal. Accusations of cursing, making love potions, or summoning demons. If you were a woman in medieval Europe who knew how to make a decent stew, soothe a fever, or get a man to stop ignoring you at the market, congratulations, you were probably a witch. Because nothing said suspicious, like a woman with knowledge, confidence, or a particularly fragrant herb pouch. And if you were accused of cursing someone, well, that was practically a community sport. Curses were the medieval version of Yelp reviews, except instead of leaving a 1-star rating, you allegedly whispered a few words, spat on a rock, and suddenly your neighbor's cow was walking backward and mooing in Latin. People believed curses could cause illness, infertility, impotence, bad luck, and even bread that wouldn't rise. And in a world where bread was life, that was basically an act of war. But it wasn't just curses. Oh no. The real scandal came with love potions. These were the medieval equivalent of swiping right. Except instead of a dating app, you had a bubbling cauldron and a questionable understanding of consent. Love potions were said to make someone fall hopelessly in love with you, or at least mildly interested for the duration of a harvest festival. Ingredients varied wildly: rose petals, honey, wine, powdered beetles, fingernail clippings, and, if you were really committed, a drop of your own blood. Romantic, right? Of course, if a relationship went sour, the potion maker was blamed. He used to love me, but now he only stares at the wall and hums Gregorian chants. Clearly, I've been hexed. And God help the poor soul who actually sold love potions. They were walking targets for accusations, especially if their concoctions worked a little too well, or not at all. Either way, someone was ending up in court. And then there were the big league accusations summoning demons. This was the medieval equivalent of being accused of hacking the divine mainframe. People believed witches could call forth demons to do their bidding, whether that meant ruining crops, spreading disease, or just making your neighbor's beard fall out in patches. Some were said to draw magic circles, chant in forbidden tongues, and offer sacrifices, usually symbolic, occasionally poultry, based to attract infernal attention. The church was particularly obsessed with this idea. Summoning demons wasn't just heresy. It was treason against heaven. Manuals were written detailing how to spot a demon. Summoner, did they own black candles? Did they read books not written by monks? Did they have a suspiciously well-behaved cat? Burn them. And the accused? They often confessed, because when the alternative was being stretched, poked, or dunked repeatedly in a freezing river, you'd admit to summoning Beelzebub just to get a blanket. Which brings us to the next grim chapter in this tale of paranoia and persecution, torture and confessions. Flying at night, meeting the devil, once accused of witchcraft in medieval and early modern Europe. You didn't just get a stern talking to and a slap on the wrist. No, you were in for a full-blown theatrical production of pain, paranoia, and wildly imaginative storytelling. Most of it extracted under torture so creative it made Dante's Inferno look like a spa brochure. Authorities weren't interested in whether you actually did anything. They wanted a confession. And not just any confession. They wanted the deluxe, extended director's cut, midnight flights, pacts with Satan, goat transformations, and a guest appearance by Beelzebub himself. The more dramatic, the better. If your confession didn't include at least one instance of flying naked through the night sky on a broomstick or a butter churn, were you even trying? Torture devices varied by region and imagination. There were thumbscrews, racks, leg crushers, and the ever-popular strapado, where you were hoisted into the air by your arms, and then dropped suddenly to dislocate your shoulders. Because nothing says truth serum like involuntary yoga. And if that didn't work, they'd just keep going until you either confessed or passed out, or both. Under this kind of pressure, people confessed to everything. Yes, I flew to a witch's sabbath on the back of a goat named Joffrey. Yes, I kissed the devil's backside and signed his book in blood. Yes, I turned into a cat and stole a pie. The confessions were so bizarre and theatrical that they read like the fever dreams of a very anxious playwright with a grudge against livestock. One woman in Scotland confessed to being visited by a demon in the form of a ferret named Satan, who sucked blood from her fingers at night. Another claimed she flew to a Sabbath, where witches danced in circles, feasted on roasted babies, and discussed the weather. Apparently, even the devil's minions can't resist small talk. A meeting the devil was a recurring theme. He was often described as a man in black, a shadowy figure with cloven hooves, or, my personal favorite, a gentleman with a charming hat and terrible table manners. Witches were said to renounce their baptism, kiss him in awkward places, and receive a devil's mark, in return a mole, wart, or oddly shaped freckle that investigators would poke with needles to see if it bled. If it didn't, that was proof. If it did, well, still proof. It was a very flexible system. And let's not forget the flying. Witches were believed to soar through the night sky to secret gatherings, often smeared in magical ointments made from herbs, animal fat, and possibly the tears of disappointed saints. They flew on broomsticks, pitchforks, chairs, or anything vaguely aerodynamic. One poor soul confessed to flying on a butter churn, which is both impractical and deeply undignified. These confessions were then used to accuse others, creating a domino effect of paranoia. She flew with me. He danced with the devil. They brought snacks. Entire communities were swept up in the madness, with neighbors turning on each other faster than you could say, "Unholy Sabbath." But even with all the torture and theatrics, some people still refused to confess. So authorities turned to another method, one that involved ropes, rivers, and a very questionable understanding of physics. Swimming, witches as a test for guilt. Ah yes, the infamous witch swim test. Because when you're not sure if someone's in league with the devil, the obvious solution is to tie them up and throw them in a pond. This charming little ritual, also known as the ordeal by water, was medieval Europe's version of trial by splash. And it was about as scientific as diagnosing a fever by licking a rock. Here's how it worked: the accused witch, usually a woman, often elderly, and almost always someone who had annoyed the wrong neighbor, was bound hand to foot, typically with the right thumb tied to the left big toe, and vice versa, because symmetry is important when you're about to be dunked like a cursed tea bag. Then, with ropes attached sick for retrieval, not mercy, she was lowered into a body of water, a river, a pond, or the nearest suspiciously murky duck habitat. Now, here's the logic, and I use that term loosely. Water, being pure and holy, and apparently very judgmental, was believed to reject the unholy. So, if the accused floated, it meant the water had refused to accept her, and she was clearly guilty. If she sank, the water had embraced her, and she was innocent. Of course, if she sank too fast, and no one pulled her out in time, she was innocent and dead. But hey, at least her name was cleared. This test was based on the idea that witches had renounced baptism, and thus water, especially baptismal water, would literally spit them out like a bad oyster. It was a divine judgment, a holy verdict, a cosmic thumbs up or thumbs down delivered via splash. And if that sounds absurd, congratulations. You're thinking like someone who's not trying to explain why their butter won't churn. The practice wasn't even officially sanctioned by the church for most of its history. In fact, by the 13th century, the clergy had largely withdrawn support for the ordeal, citing the minor theological issue that it wasn't in the Bible and might be, tempting God. But that didn't stop local communities from reviving it during the height of the witch craze in the 16th and 17th centuries. Because when crops fail and your neighbor's goat starts speaking in tongues, you don't need theology. You need a scapegoat and a pond. And let's not pretend this was a rare occurrence. In England, Germany, and parts of Eastern Europe, swimming, witches became a spectator sport. Crowds would gather, ropes would be tied, and someone would shout, "She floats!"
"She's a witch!"
while someone else muttered, "God help us all." Sometimes the accused were dunked 3 times, just to be sure, because nothing says fair trial like repeated near drowning. There were even techniques to ensure a good float. Some testers would arch the accused back or tie them in a way that made floating more likely, because a guilty verdict was more exciting. And let's be honest, no one came to the pond to see someone sink quietly and go home. And if the accused managed to float and look smug about it, double guilty. Probably consorted with demons and overcooked the pottage. Of course, not everyone was on board with this aquatic nonsense. Some physicians and theologians argued that the test was unreliable, unholy, and just plain dumb. But their voices were often drowned out, pun intended, by the roar of the crowd and the splash of another poor soul being tossed into the drink. And yet, despite the absurdity, the swimming test persisted for centuries. Because when fear takes hold, fear of witches, of the unknown, of your neighbor's suspiciously healthy chickens, logic goes out the window, and superstition dives headfirst into the nearest pond. But while peasants were busy dunking their neighbors, the upper crust had their own brand of magical thinking. They weren't tossing people into rivers. They were consulting the stars. Which brings us to the next glittering chapter. Kings and nobles hiring astrologers for war decisions. In the grand courts of medieval and Renaissance Europe, where velvet robes swept marble floors, and every meal involved at least one roasted peacock, kings and nobles weren't just consulting generals and advisors. They were also peeking nervously at the stars. Because when you're about to launch a war that could bankrupt your treasury and get half your cousins killed, you want to make sure Mars is in a good mood. Astrologers weren't fringe figures in these courts. They were essential personnel, right up there with the royal physician and the guy who made sure the king's codpiece sparkled. These celestial consultants were tasked with interpreting the heavens to determine the most auspicious time to do just about anything. Declare war, sign treaties, crown hares, or even go to the bathroom if Mercury was feeling particularly retrograde. Take John Dee, for example, mathematician, alchemist, and Queen Elizabeth I's personal astrologer. Dee wasn't just some guy with a telescope and a dream. He was a trusted advisor who selected the date of Elizabeth's coronation based on planetary alignments. He also claimed to speak with angels using a crystal ball, which in the 16th century was considered only mildly eccentric and not at all a reason to revoke someone's security clearance. And it wasn't just the English. The Medici family in Florence, those Renaissance powerhouses of art, banking, and dramatic family feuds, also kept astrologers on retainer. Lorenzo de' Medici reportedly wouldn't schedule a banquet, let alone a political maneuver, without checking the stars. Because nothing says diplomatic success like knowing Venus is in Libra and your enemies are in retrograde. Even Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France and part-time occult enthusiast, was known to consult astrologers before making major decisions. One of her favorites, Nostradamus. Yes, that Nostradamus. The guy who wrote cryptic prophecies that people still misinterpret today. He was summoned to court not just for his poetic doom-scrolling, but because Catherine believed he could help her navigate the treacherous waters of French politics, which were basically Game of Thrones with more lace. Astrologers were expected to calculate birth charts, electional charts, to pick the best time for an event, and horary charts to answer specific questions like, will I win this battle? Or, is my brother plotting against me? These charts were complex, involving planetary positions, lunar phases, and enough Latin to make a monk weep. And God help the astrologer who got it wrong. A failed prediction could mean exile, disgrace, or, if the king was feeling particularly moody, a sudden and permanent career change involving a dungeon. But when they got it right, oh, the glory. A well-timed victory, a successful alliance, a royal birth on a lucky day. These were all seen as proof that the stars favored the ruler, and by extension, that the ruler was chosen by divine forces. Astrology wasn't just a tool, it was propaganda, a way to legitimize power and soothe the nerves of monarchs, who were one bad harvest away from a peasant uprising. And let's not forget the military applications. Generals would delay campaigns based on lunar eclipses. Battles were launched at dawn because Jupiter was rising. Armies refused to march if Saturn was in a malefic house. One can only imagine the frustration of soldiers waiting in full armor, while their commander consulted a guy in a robe who said, "Not today, Mars is square with Uranus." Of course, not everyone believed in astrology. Some nobles scoffed, others hedged their bets, and a few just used it as an excuse when things went sideways. We lost the battle. Clearly the astrologer misread the stars. Off with his head. Also, someone fetch me a new one. Preferably one who says I'm destined for greatness. But while kings were consulting the heavens for war and glory, queens had their own secretive dealings, often whispered about in corridors and cloaked in scandal. Rumors of queens using potions and charms for fertility. In the glittering courts of medieval and Renaissance Europe, where royal lineage was everything and hares were the currency of power, fertility wasn't just a personal concern. It was a national crisis. If a queen failed to produce an heir, it wasn't chalked up to biology or stress, or the fact that her husband bathed once a month and ate mostly venison. No, it was whispered that she was cursed, or barren, or, more tantalizingly, secretly dabbling in magic to fix the problem. And so began the long, candlelit tradition of queens turning to potions, charms, and the occasional suspiciously well-informed midwife in their quest for royal offspring. These weren't just idle rumors whispered by bored courtiers. They were full-blown court scandals, complete with coded letters, mysterious visitors, and the occasional, borrowed, relic from a saint's shrine. Take Elizabeth Woodville, Queen Consort of Edward IV of England. She was accused by her enemies of using sorcery to seduce the king and secure her place on the throne. And while there's no proof she ever brewed a love potion in the royal kitchens, the fact that she rose from minor nobility to queen in a political blink made people very suspicious. After all, what could explain such a meteoric rise, other than a well-timed charm and a strategically placed sprig of rue? Then there's Joan of Navarre, Queen of England through her marriage to Henry IV. She was accused of using witchcraft to try to kill her stepson, Henry V, but the charges also included rumors that she had used magical means to enhance her fertility and secure her position. She was imprisoned for years, though eventually released, possibly because someone realized that being a woman with ambition wasn't technically a crime. Yet, fertility charms were often a blend of Christian and pagan traditions. A queen might wear a pendant containing a saint's relic, say, a splinter of bone from Saint Margaret, patron saint of childbirth, while also carrying a pouch of herbs like verbena, mugwort, or mandrake root, all believed to stimulate conception. Some charms were embroidered into clothing, hidden in bed linens, or even baked into bread. Yes, medieval fertility bread was a thing. No, it didn't taste good, Guy. And then there were the potions. These were usually brewed in secret by trusted women, midwives, herbalists, or court wise women, who knew just how much powdered deer antler and honey to mix with crushed rose petals and a dash of desperation. Some potions were meant to open the womb. Others were meant to warm the blood. A few were probably just wine with herbs, which, to be fair, is still how some people cope with family planning today. Of course, these practices were deeply risky. If a queen was caught using charms or potions, she could be accused of witchcraft, heresy, or worse, trying to manipulate divine will. And God help her if the potion didn't work. Not only would she still be childless, but now she'd be childless and suspiciously fragrant with mugwort. Yet despite the danger, the rumors persisted, because the stakes were high. A queen who bore a son secured her legacy, her safety, and often her husband's affection. A queen who didn't, she risked divorce, exile, or a one-way ticket to a convent. So if someone offered her a charm that promised to open the gates of life, she might just take it, quietly, carefully, and with a prayer that no one found out. And while queens were whispering over potions in candlelit chambers, others were drawing circles in the dirt and calling on spirits, not for babies, but for buried treasure. Treasure finding using magic circles and spirits in the grand tradition of get-rich-quick schemes. Medieval Europe had its own version of the lottery, magical treasure hunting. But instead of scratch cards and suspicious emails from foreign princes, this involved drawing elaborate circles in the dirt, chanting in Latin, and summoning spirits who may or may not have been in the mood to help. The idea was simple. Somewhere beneath your feet, perhaps under a ruined abbey, a lonely hill, or your neighbor's suspiciously lumpy vegetable patch, lay buried treasure. Gold, jewels, ancient relics, or even enchanted objects left behind by Romans, Vikings, or the occasional bored demon. But you couldn't just dig it up like a common mole. No, you needed magic. And not just any magic. You needed a circle. These weren't your average doodles in the dirt. Magic circles were carefully constructed diagrams, often inscribed with divine names, astrological symbols, and protective sigils. They were meant to shield the treasure seeker from whatever spiritual entity was guarding the loot. Because naturally, all good treasure came with a demonic bouncer. Some circles were simple rings. Others looked like the floor plan of a particularly paranoid wizard's gazebo. The process went something like this. Choose your location, ideally somewhere rumored to be haunted, cursed, or just really inconvenient to dig. Draw the circle, using chalk, charcoal, or whatever you had on hand that wasn't already cursed. Recite the conjuration, a mix of Latin, Hebrew, and "please don't eat me" muttering. Summon the spirit, usually a demon, angel, or ghost with insider knowledge of underground banking. Negotiate, because spirits are notoriously bureaucratic. You might have to promise a favor, a sacrifice, or just not to scream too loudly. Dig, but only if the spirit gives you the go-ahead. Otherwise, you risk being cursed, possessed, or mildly inconvenienced for eternity. Some treasure hunters even brought magical tools, wands, swords, or divining rods carved with planetary symbols. Others used mirrors or crystals to see the treasure's location. And if things got really serious, they'd bring a medium. Someone who could communicate with the spirit world, or at least pretend convincingly while everyone else was too scared to question it. Of course, the church was not a fan. Summoning spirits for personal gain was frowned upon, especially if it involved demons, necromancy, or skipping mass to go dig up a haunted turnip field. But that didn't stop people. The promise of hidden wealth was too tempting. And if you could get rich and show off your Latin pronunciation, that was practically sainthood. Naturally, most treasure hunts ended in disappointment, confusion, or mild trench foot. But every now and then, someone would find something. A coin, a bone, a rusty spoon, and declare victory. "The spirits have spoken!" they'd cry, while everyone else nodded and quietly backed away. Still, the belief persisted. Because in a world where wealth was rare, life was hard, and demons were just a bad dream away, the idea that you could draw a circle, say a few words, and uncover a fortune was too magical to resist. And when it came time to face real danger, not just buried treasure, but actual battle, people turned to a different kind of magic, using talismans and blessed relics before battles. In the high-stakes world of medieval warfare, where armor was heavy, swords were sharp, and personal hygiene was optional, soldiers didn't just rely on brute strength and military strategy. No, They also brought along their lucky charms, sacred tokens, and blessed relics, because when you're charging into a field full of angry men with pointy sticks, you want every advantage you can get, even if it's a splinter of St. Cuthbert's femur tied around your neck. Let's start with talismans. These were personal items believed to hold magical or divine power, often worn or carried into battle like spiritual armor. They came in all shapes and sizes: carved stones, inscribed metal discs, tiny scrolls with protective verses, or even bits of cloth that had been blessed by a priest and smelled faintly of incense and fear. Some knights wore amulets engraved with crosses or angelic names, while others preferred more exotic options, like a dried toad sewn into a pouch for courage or a wolf's tooth for ferocity. If it sounded vaguely mystical and fit in a pocket, someone probably wore it into battle. Then there were the blessed relics, which were basically the VIP passes of divine protection. These were physical remains or belongings of saints: bones, teeth, hair, sandals, or in one case, a particularly holy belt buckle. Relics were believed to radiate spiritual power, and carrying one into battle was like having a hotline to heaven. Some commanders even brought entire reliquaries, ornate boxes containing saintly bits, onto the battlefield, parading them before the troops like divine mascots. "Behold, the toe of Saint Bartholomew! Now go stab someone for God." Monarchs and generals took this very seriously. Charlemagne reportedly carried relics into battle, and Richard the Lionheart was said to have worn a cross blessed by the Pope himself. In some cases, entire banners were made from relics, fluttering above the chaos like spiritual fee signals. And if you were lucky enough to fight under one of these banners, you could rest assured that even if you died horribly, you'd probably go to heaven slightly faster. But it wasn't just about protection. Talismans and relics were also used to inspire morale. Imagine being a terrified foot soldier, clutching a rusty spear and wondering if this was the day you'd be turned into a human pincushion. Then along comes a priest, waving a relic and shouting, "Fear not! St. George is with us!" Suddenly, you're not just fighting for your life, you're fighting with divine backup. It's like having a celestial hype man. Of course, not all talismans were church-approved. Some soldiers carried folk charms, bits of bone herbs, or even engraved lead tablets with protective spells. These were often frowned upon by clergy, who preferred their magic to come with a Latin blessing and a receipt. But in the heat of battle, no one was checking credentials. If it made you feel safer, it was good enough. And let's not forget the rituals. Before battle, soldiers might kiss a relic, touch a holy object, or recite a specific prayer while holding their talisman. Some even anointed their weapons with holy oil or dipped their swords in blessed water, just in case the enemy was particularly demonic that day. One chronicler even describes a knight who refused to mount his horse until his lucky charm had been properly aligned with the North Star. He was late to the battle. He survived. Coincidence? In short, talismans and relics were the medieval version of better safe than sorry. They offered comfort, courage, and a sense of cosmic insurance in a world where death was always just a javelin away. And if you happened to win the battle, well, clearly the relic worked. If you lost, you probably forgot to say the prayer correctly, or your relic was counterfeit. Should have gone with the deluxe saint package. But while warriors were consulting saints and stuffing their armor with holy trinkets, everyday folks were looking to the skies for guidance on far more mundane matters, like when to plant their cabbages, deliver a baby, or remove a suspicious mole. Astrology used for daily tasks: planting, childbirth, and surgery. In medieval Europe, astrology wasn't just for starry-eyed romantics or cloaked wizards muttering about Mercury retrograde. It was a practical, everyday tool. a cosmic calendar that guided everything from when to sow your barley to when to yank out a rotten molar. If the stars weren't aligned, neither were your vegetables, your baby, or your spleen. Let's start with planting. Medieval farmers didn't just toss seeds into the ground and hope for the best. They consulted lunaria, astrological almanacs that told them when the moon was waxing, waning, or just generally in a mood. The waxing moon, when it's growing, was ideal for planting crops that grow above ground, like beans, lettuce, or your neighbor's gossip. The waning moon, when it's shrinking, was better for root vegetables, pruning, and weeding. And never plant anything during a lunar eclipse, unless you wanted your carrots to come out looking like eldritch horrors. But it wasn't just the moon. The zodiac signs played a role too. Each sign was associated with an element: earth, air, fire, or water. And each element had its own agricultural vibe. Earth signs: Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn, great for planting and transplanting. Your potatoes will thank you. Water signs: Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces, are ideal for leafy greens and juicy fruits. Also good for emotional breakdowns in the cabbage patch. Fire signs: Aries, Leo, Sagittarius, best for pest control and burning things. Not so great for delicate herbs. Air signs: Gemini, Libra, Aquarius, good for harvesting, drying, and talking to your plants like they're old friends. Now let's talk about childbirth. If you were expecting a baby in medieval times, you didn't just count the weeks and hope for the best. You consulted the stars. Midwives and astrologers worked together to determine the most auspicious time for delivery. Was the moon in a fertile sign? Was Venus behaving herself? Was Mars far, far away from anything involving your uterus? Some believed that being born under certain signs gave children specific traits. A baby born under Leo might be brave and noble. A Pisces child might be dreamy and artistic. A Scorpio baby, probably already plotting something. And if the stars weren't favorable, some midwives would delay labor with herbs or encourage it with chants and pressure points, because nothing says safe delivery like a bit of celestial micromanagement. And then there was surgery. Oh boy. If you needed something removed, stitched, or poked, you didn't just schedule it for Tuesday. You checked the zodiac man, a charmingly illustrated figure showing which sign ruled which body part: Aries, head; Taurus, neck; Gemini, arms; Cancer, chest; Leo, heart; Virgo, abdomen; Libra, lower back; Scorpio, reproductive organs; Sagittarius, thighs; Capricorn, knees; Aquarius, shins; Pisces, feet. If the moon was in the sign that ruled the body part you were operating on, don't do it. That was considered a cosmic no-no. So if you needed a head wound stitched, you'd better wait until the moon had moved out of Aries. Otherwise, you risked excessive bleeding, infection, or the patient waking up convinced they were a goat. Astrology was woven into the very fabric of daily life. It wasn't just about fate, it was about timing. When to plant, when to harvest, when to give birth, when to cut, when to pray, when to run. The stars were a cosmic instruction manual, and ignoring them was like trying to bake bread without checking the oven temperature. But while peasants and midwives were consulting the heavens for practical advice, another group was gazing at the stars with a different goal in mind. Not to time a cabbage harvest, but to unlock the secrets of the universe. Alchemists trying to turn lead into gold or find immortality. Alchemists, the original overachievers of the medieval world. While everyone else was busy surviving plagues, sharpening pitchforks, or arguing about whether cats were witches, these ambitious souls were holed up in smoky laboratories, trying to turn lead into gold and live forever. Just your average Tuesday goals. Alchemy was a heady mix of proto-chemistry, mysticism, philosophy, and a dash of wishful thinking. It wasn't just about getting rich, though that was definitely a perk. It was about unlocking the secrets of the universe. Alchemists believed that all matter was in a state of transformation, and that with the right knowledge, and possibly a goat's skull or two, they could speed up nature's process and perfect it. Lead, being dull and heavy, was seen as an imperfect metal. Gold, on the other hand, was the Beyoncé of the periodic table, radiant, incorruptible, and universally admired. So naturally, the goal was to turn one into the other. Enter the philosopher's stone, the mythical substance that could supposedly transmute base metals into gold and grant eternal life. It was the holy grail of alchemy, the ultimate cheat code. Some believed it was a literal stone. Others thought it was a red powder, a glowing elixir, or a metaphor for spiritual enlightenment. Either way, everyone wanted it, and no one could find it. Though that didn't stop them from writing thousands of pages about it in cryptic symbols, riddles, and enough Latin to make a monk cry. Alchemists like Nicholas Flamel became legendary for allegedly discovering the stone. Flamel, a 14th century French scribe, was rumoured to have unlocked the secret to immortality and was last seen not dying. His house in Paris became a pilgrimage site for aspiring alchemists and conspiracy theorists alike. Spoil it, he probably just had good PR behind, but alchemy wasn't all glitter and gold. It involved dangerous experiments, toxic fumes, and a lot of trial and error. Picture a man in a robe, hunched over a bubbling cauldron, muttering incantations while trying not to blow himself up. Mercury, sulfur, and arsenic were common ingredients. So were animal parts, herbs, and occasionally bodily fluids. If it smelled bad and looked worse, it probably went into the flask. And yet, despite the chaos, alchemists made real contributions to science. They developed distillation techniques, lab equipment, and early chemical processes. They were the bridge between ancient mysticism and modern chemistry, equal parts wizard and scientist, with a flair for the dramatic and a deep love of obscure symbols. But let's not pretend they weren't also a little obsessed with immortality. Many alchemists believed that by purifying metals, they could also purify the soul. The transformation of lead into gold was symbolic of the transformation of the self, from flawed and mortal to perfect and eternal. Some even claimed to have created the elixir of life, a potion that could grant eternal youth. Side effects may have included hallucinations, spontaneous combustion, and being chased out of town. Still, the dream persisted. Because in a world full of disease, war, and questionable hygiene, the idea that you could live forever and be rich while doing it was just too good to pass up. And while most alchemists toiled in obscurity, scribbling in notebooks and accidentally poisoning themselves with mercury, a lucky few caught the attention of royalty, who were more than happy to fund their experiments, as long as there was a chance of turning a pile of scrap metal into a royal treasury. Which brings us to the next glittering chapter. Royal courts funding alchemists, hoping for wealth. If you were a monarch in medieval or Renaissance Europe, and your treasury was looking a little thin, perhaps due to a war, a wedding, or an unfortunate investment in plague insurance, you didn't just raise taxes or mint more coins. No, you summoned an alchemist. Because why settle for silver when you could theoretically turn your chamber pot into gold? Royal courts across Europe became hotbeds of alchemical ambition, where kings, queens, and nobles poured fortunes into the bubbling cauldrons of men who promised to unlock the secrets of the universe, or at least the secrets of how to make your enemies jealous of your shiny new crown. Let's start with the basics. Why did royals fund alchemists? Gold. Always gold. The dream of transmuting base metals into gold was irresistible. It wasn't just about wealth. It was about control. If you could make gold, you didn't need to tax your peasants or borrow from the bankers in Florence. You could fund wars, build cathedrals, and throw banquets with swan-shaped pastries without blinking. Immortality. Because what's the point of being fabulously rich if you're going to die like a commoner? Alchemists promised not only gold but also the elixir of life, a potion that could grant eternal youth, perfect health, and possibly the ability to tolerate court politics. Prestige. Having an alchemist on staff was a status symbol. It said, "I am a ruler of vision, science, and extremely questionable budgeting decisions." One of the most famous examples is Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who turned his court in Prague into a glittering madhouse of mystics, magicians, and alchemists. He collected rare manuscripts, strange instruments, and enough mercury to make a modern chemist faint. His court was home to Edward Kelly and John Dee, two Englishmen who claimed to speak with angels and decipher the language of creation. Rudolph was so enchanted by their promises that he gave them titles, money, and probably a few confused looks from his advisors. Then there was James Ivy of Scotland, who funded an alchemist named John Damian. Damian was so confident in his abilities that he once attempted to fly using wings made of feathers and wax. He leapt from the walls of Stirling Castle and promptly plummeted into a dung heap. He survived, but his dignity did not. Still, James kept him around, because you never know when a man who smells like failure might stumble upon immortality. Even Henry VI of England got in on the action, issuing royal patents to alchemists who claimed they could produce gold. These patents were essentially get-out-of-jail-free cards, protecting the alchemists from accusations of fraud or sorcery, as long as they kept the gold eye, or at least the hope of gold, flowing. But not all alchemists were charlatans. Some were genuinely brilliant, laying the groundwork for modern chemistry. They experimented with distillation, metallurgy, and mineralogy. They developed new dyes, medicines, and even early forms of gunpowder. But let's be honest, most kings weren't funding them for their contributions to science. They wanted bling and eternal youth, not a better understanding of sulfur. The relationship between alchemists and their royal patrons was often tense. If the experiments failed, the alchemist might be dismissed, imprisoned, or, if the king was having a particularly bad day, executed. If the experiment succeeded, the alchemist might be rewarded with land, titles, or a suspiciously large number of people asking, "So, how exactly did you do that?" Some alchemists played the game well. They produced just enough glittery powder and cryptic diagrams to keep their patrons hopeful, while always insisting that the real breakthrough was just around the corner. "We're very close, Your Majesty. Just one more ingredient. Possibly unicorn horn or a dragon sneeze. We're working on it." And the kings, they kept funding it. Because in a world where power was everything, the promise of unlimited gold and eternal life was too tempting to resist, even if it came from a man in a robe who smelled like burnt lead and disappointment. But not all magical protections came in the form of bubbling flasks and smoky laboratories. Some were much smaller, more personal, and worn close to the skin, rings inscribed with prayers for protection. In the medieval world, jewelry wasn't just about fashion. It was about function, and that function was usually, "Please don't let me die horribly." Among the most cherished and widely worn items were rings inscribed with prayers, sacred names, or protective symbols. These weren't just accessories, they were portable shields, miniature relics, and spiritual panic buttons all rolled into one. These rings were often made of silver or bronze, sometimes gold if you were fancy, or had recently inherited a suspiciously well-timed estate. The inscriptions varied depending on region, religion, and how much space you had to work with. Some bore Latin prayers, like Ave Maria or Dis me protegat, "May God protect me." Others featured biblical verses, angelic names, or magical symbols that looked like someone had tried to draw a chicken using only triangles. One popular choice was the Pater Noster ring inscribed with the Lord's Prayer. It was believed to protect the wearer from illness, misfortune, and demonic flatulence. Another favorite was the Satyr Square, a magical palindrome that read the same forwards, backwards, and upside down, because nothing says divine protection, like confusing your enemies with grammar. But these rings weren't just worn, they were activated. That's right, you didn't just slip one on and call it a day. You had to bless it, pray over it, or in some cases, dip it in holy water while reciting a psalm, and avoiding eye contact with any nearby goats. Some rings were even buried for a night, under a church altar to absorb extra holiness, like a spiritual phone charger. And they weren't just for protection from demons. People wore them to guard against plague, lightning, witchcraft, jealousy, and bad dreams. One particularly dramatic ring from 14th century France was inscribed with a prayer to Saint Michael, the archangel who specialized in smiting evil and looking fabulous while doing it. The ring's owner believed it would protect him in battle, in court, and during awkward family dinners. These rings were also deeply personal. They were given as gifts, passed down through generations, and sometimes even buried with the dead to protect them in the afterlife. Some were engraved with the names of loved ones, saints, or the occasional cryptic phrase like, "Do not trust the baker," which raises more questions than it answers. And let's not forget the superstitions. If your ring cracked, it meant it had absorbed a curse meant for you. If it went missing, someone was probably trying to hex you. If it turned green, well, that was probably just copper oxidation. But in medieval logic, it could also mean you'd angered a saint or eaten cursed cheese. Even royalty got in on the action. Kings and queens wore rings inscribed with divine names, angelic sigils, and protective verses, believing they would shield them from assassination, betrayal, and bad fashion choices. Some rings were so powerful, they were said to glow in the presence of evil, which, in a royal court, meant they were basically nightlights. But while rings were the everyday person's go-to for portable protection, there was another, rarer tool for peering into the unknown. A tool that shimmered with mystery, whispered secrets, and looked fabulous on a velvet cushion. Crystal balls for scrying, though rare. In the grand cabinet of medieval curiosities, wedged somewhere between frog hearts and owl feathers, sat the crystal ball, shimmering with mystery and the faint scent of incense and overconfidence. While not as common as herbs or holy water, crystal balls were the Ferraris of divination tools, rare, expensive, and guaranteed to make your neighbors whisper about you behind their tapestries, scrying or seeing. Into the unknown was the art of gazing into a reflective surface, water, polished metal, or, if you were really fancy, a perfectly spherical orb of crystal, to receive visions, messages, or occasionally, a very dramatic headache. The crystal ball was believed to act as a window between worlds, a kind of spiritual Wi-Fi router connecting the seer to divine realms, ancestral spirits, or just their own overactive imagination. But let's be clear, owning a crystal ball was no small feat. These weren't mass-produced trinkets from the local apothecary. They were rare, costly, and often imported, made from clear quartz, beryl, or even smoky amethyst. A good crystal ball had to be flawless. No bubbles, no cracks, no suspicious goat hair embedded in the surface. The clearer the ball, the clearer the visions. Or, so they said. Some were no bigger than a plum. Others were the size of a cabbage and required their own velvet throne. The process of scrying was equal parts ritual and performance. The seer, usually a cunning person mystic, or someone who had mastered the art of looking serious while staring at glass, would place the crystal ball on a stand or cushion, light candles, burn herbs like mugwort or frankincense, and begin to gaze, not glance. Not peek, gaze. With the intensity of someone trying to remember if they left the oven on. The room had to be quiet, dimly lit, and preferably free of distractions like barking dogs or skeptical spouses. The seer would enter a trance, like state, eyes fixed on the orb, waiting for images to form, clouds, faces, symbols, or entire scenes playing out like a medieval Netflix preview. Some claimed to see the future, others saw the past. A few just saw their own reflection, and decided that was enough excitement for one evening. And what did people ask the crystal ball? Oh, everything. Will I marry well? Is my neighbor a witch? Where did I leave my second best spoon? The ball was consulted for lost objects, love affairs, political intrigue, and the occasional ghost problem. It was the medieval version of Google. If Google required candles and a dramatic cloak, despite their mystique, crystal balls were not universally trusted. The church viewed them with suspicion, lumping them in with necromancy, heresy, and other hobbies that could get you excommunicated or worse. Some balls were confiscated, smashed, or hidden away in dusty cupboards by nervous monks, who didn't want to explain why Sister Agnes was suddenly predicting the weather with alarming accuracy. Still, the allure remained. Even kings and nobles dabbled in scrying, often in secret. A well-placed vision could influence a marriage, a treaty, or a war. And if the ball didn't deliver, well, clearly the stars were cloudy that night, or the spirit realm was on lunch break. Today, crystal balls are often seen as kitschy or theatrical, but in their time, they were powerful symbols of knowledge, mystery, and the human desire to peek behind the cosmic curtain. They represented the belief that the universe was not random, but readable, if only you had the right lens. And while the crystal ball was rare, there was another form of portable protection and power that was far more common. Worn close to the skin, etched with sacred words, and believed to guard the soul itself. Amulets with Latin or Hebrew inscriptions. In the medieval world, if you weren't wearing at least one amulet inscribed with sacred text, were you even trying to survive the week? These weren't just trinkets. They were spiritual armor, portable prayers, and cosmic insurance policies, all rolled into one. Whether etched in Latin, Hebrew, or a charmingly illegible mix of both, these amulets were believed to protect the wearer from everything from demonic possession to stubbed toes. Let's start with the Latin inscriptions. These were often drawn from Christian scripture, especially the Psalms, which were basically the Swiss Army knife of divine protection. A popular choice was Vade retro Satana. Get thee behind me, Satan, which was the medieval equivalent of not today, demon. Others featured entire verses, like Psalm 91, which promised deliverance from pestilence, arrows, and possibly your cousin Gerald's terrible cooking. Latin amulets were often worn around the neck, sewn into clothing, or tucked into belt pouches. Some were engraved onto rings, etched into metal discs, or written on parchment and rolled into tiny scrolls. These scrolls were then sealed in silver or bronze tubes and worn like a necklace, because nothing says fashion forward like a tiny tube of divine text bouncing against your sternum. And these weren't just for Jews or Christians. In the melting pot of medieval Europe and the Mediterranean, amulets often blended traditions. You might find a Latin prayer alongside a Hebrew name of God, wrapped in a Greek-style scroll, and worn by someone who also carried a rabbit's foot. It was a spiritual buffet, and everyone was piling their plate high. The inscriptions weren't always legible. Sometimes they were abbreviated, coded, or written in magical alphabets like Malachim or celestial script. This wasn't just for secrecy. It was believed that the act of writing in a sacred or obscure script added mystical potency. Plus, It made it harder for your enemies to copy your homework. And let's not forget the amulet makers. Scribes, monks, rabbis, and cunning folk who specialized in crafting these tiny talismans. They were part calligrapher, part theologian, part spiritual locksmith. Some even claimed to receive their designs in dreams or visions, which is a great way to explain why your amulet looks like a doodle from a sleep-deprived librarian. These amulets were worn by soldiers into battle, mothers during childbirth, travelers on long journeys, and merchants hoping for good fortune. They were buried with the dead, passed down through families, and occasionally swallowed in moments of extreme desperation. Not recommended. But while amulets were personal and portable, there were other objects, larger, older, and often housed in churches or shrines, that were believed to hold even greater power. These weren't just protective, they were miraculous. Which brings us to the next sacred stop: relics believed to have magical properties. In the medieval imagination, few things shimmered with more awe, reverence, and supernatural potential than relics. These weren't just dusty bones or scraps of cloth. They were divine conduits, miracle machines, and spiritual VIP passes to the celestial realm. If you were lucky enough to own one, or even just touch one, you were basically holding a backstage pass to God's power. Relics came in three main flavors. First, class relics: actual body parts of saints, bones, teeth, hair, the occasional incorruptible toe. Second, class relics: items the saint had touched or used, robes, sandals, walking sticks, or that one spoon they really liked. Third class relics: objects that had touched a first or second class relic. These were the spiritual equivalent of shaking hands with someone who once met Beyoncé. These relics were believed to possess miraculous powers, healing the sick, protecting cities, calming storms, and occasionally spontaneously weeping, which was either a sign of divine sorrow or that someone had left them too close to the soup pot. Let's talk about some of the greatest hits in the relic world. The true cross fragments of the cross were so widely distributed that, if you gathered them all, you could probably build a modest cathedral. Still, each splinter was treated like a divine lightning rod, capable of healing wounds, repelling demons, and making your enemies deeply uncomfortable. The blood of Saint Januarius, housed in Naples. This relic was and still is a vial of dried blood that miraculously liquefies on certain feast days. If it doesn't liquefy, people panic. It's like a divine mood ring with apocalyptic consequences. The bones of Saint Cuthbert, the arm of Saint George, the head of Saint Catherine, and the tongue of Saint Anthony. Yes, his tongue, were all kept in ornate reliquaries, often shaped like the body part in question. Nothing says holy reverence like a gold-plated foot filled with actual foot. These relics weren't just religious curiosities. They were political powerhouses. Cities competed to acquire them. Monasteries hoarded them, and kings used them to legitimize their rule. A cathedral with a famous relic could attract pilgrims by the thousands, bringing in money, prestige, and the occasional miracle seeker who left behind a goat in gratitude. And the reliquaries, they were works of art, crafted from gold, silver, and encrusted with jewels. They looked like something out of a fantasy novel. Some were shaped like boxes, others like arms, legs, or entire busts. One particularly famous reliquary in Aachen is shaped like a shimmering golden house, because apparently nothing says sacred bone storage like medieval real estate. But not all relics were housed in grand cathedrals. Some were worn as amulets, carried into battle, or hidden in homes for protection. A splinter of a saint's bone, sewn into a pouch, could ward off illness. A scrap of a martyr's robe might protect a newborn. And if you were really lucky, you might get a drop of saintly blood mixed into a potion. Though good luck verifying the source. Of course, the line between relic and magical object was often blurry. Some relics were said to glow, levitate, or emit sweet smells. Others were believed to speak, bleed, or multiply themselves. And if you dared to steal one, God help you. There are entire legends about thieves who tried to swipe relics and were struck blind, paralyzed, or forced to return the relic by a talking donkey. Yes, really? But relics weren't just about miracles. They were about memory. They connected the living to the dead, the earthly to the divine, the now to the eternal. They were physical proof that holiness had walked the earth, and maybe, just maybe, could walk with you too. Still, not everyone trusted the dead to stay peacefully in their graves. In fact, some people were so worried about the dearly departed, making a comeback, that they took precautions, burying people with protective items to prevent them returning as spirits. In the medieval imagination, death was not a tidy conclusion. It was a potential beginning of trouble. The dearly departed were not always content to stay that way, and the line between a peaceful grave and a restless revenant was perilously thin. So, to keep the dead dead, people developed a rich and often unsettling array of burial customs designed to anchor the soul, trap the body, and prevent any posthumous mischief. Let's start with the basics: stones, nails, and scythes. These weren't just grave decor, they were spiritual security systems. In parts of Europe, it was common to place heavy stones on the chest or limbs of the deceased. The idea being that if the spirit tried to rise, it would be physically pinned down. Some graves even featured large millstones placed over the entire body, which is either a brilliant supernatural deterrent or a very passive, aggressive final gesture. Then there were the iron nails, bent and scattered across the grave or driven into the coffin. Iron was believed to repel evil and bind spirits, so a few placed nails could theoretically keep a corpse from wandering off. In some cases, nails were hammered directly into the skull or limbs of the deceased, not out of malice, but as a kind of spiritual stapling. More dramatic still were the scythes. Yes, actual blades, placed across the neck or abdomen of the corpse. The logic: if the dead tried to rise, they'd decapitate themselves in the process. It was a gruesome, but effective bit of magical engineering. In Poland, several such burials have been found, with scythes carefully positioned, like grim bookmarks between life and death. And then there were the mouth stoppers. In Italy, England, and parts of Eastern Europe, archaeologists have uncovered skeletons with stones, bricks, or coins jammed into their mouths. This wasn't dental work. It was spiritual gagging. The belief was that some revenants could rise and spread disease or curses by chewing their burial shrouds or muttering dark incantations. So stuffing the mouth shut was a way to silence them permanently. In some cases, the tongue was removed entirely and replaced with a rock. Subtle. No. Effective. Hopefully, didn't stop. Some bodies were buried face down, so if they tried to dig their way out, they'd just go deeper. Others had their legs bound, feet removed, or even heads severed and placed between their knees. A clear message that resurrection was not on the menu. In one particularly unsettling case, a woman was buried with nails driven into her jaw and a dozen more scattered around her body, suggesting that someone really didn't want her coming back for a chat. These practices weren't just about superstition, they were about control. Death was terrifying, unpredictable, and deeply personal. If someone died suddenly, violently, or under suspicious circumstances, the fear was that their soul might linger, angry and confused. So communities took action. They buried the dead with protective amulets, crosses, herbs, and sometimes padlocks. Yes, actual padlocks, attached to the toes or jaws of the deceased. The symbolism was clear. You're not going anywhere. And let's not forget the maze graves, burial sites designed with winding paths or false entrances to confuse the spirit. Because, as everyone knew, ghosts could only travel in straight lines. Apparently, spectral GPS hadn't been invented yet. These customs varied by region, but the underlying fear was the same. What if the dead don't stay dead? What if they come back? Not as peaceful ancestors, but as angry, hungry, and possibly contagious echoes of their former selves. Which brings us to the heart of the matter. Because in Eastern Europe, this fear took on a particularly vivid and blood-soaked form. The dead didn't just rise, they fed. Fear of vampires and revenants in Eastern Europe. In the shadowy folklore of Eastern Europe, few fears ran deeper than the dread of the revenant, the dead who refused to stay buried. These weren't your poetic, brooding vampires of modern fiction. No silk capes, no candlelit castles. These were bloated, ruddy-faced corpses, reeking of decay and vengeance, who clawed their way out of the grave to torment the living. And people believed in them with a fervor that bordered on obsession. The term, revenant, comes from the Latin revenire, meaning to return. And return they did, at least in the minds of terrified villagers from Romania, Serbia, Poland, Hungary, and the Balkans, where vampire legends were not just stories but urgent warnings. These creatures, known variously as stragi, upa, vrekalakas, or vegesi, were said to rise from the grave to spread disease, drain life, or simply terrorize those they had unfinished business with. The fear was so pervasive that entire communities would mobilize at the first sign of vampiric activity. A sudden death, a string of illnesses, a cow that refused to give milk. Clearly, someone had returned from the grave, and the only solution was to dig up the suspected corpse and look for signs: a fresh-looking body, blood at the mouth, or a corpse that hadn't decomposed properly. If any of these were found, the villagers didn't hesitate. They staked it, decapitated it, burned it, or all three, just to be sure. One of the most infamous cases was that of Peter Blagojevic, a Serbian peasant who died in 1725. Within days of his burial, 9 villagers died mysteriously, and several claimed on their deathbeds that Blagojevic had strangled them in the night. When his grave was open, his body was found, fresh, with blood at the mouth. The villagers wasted no time. They staked him through the heart, burned the body, and breathed a collective sigh of relief. The event was so dramatic that it was documented by a Habsburg official and helped spark the 18th century vampire panic across Europe. But Blagojevic was far from alone. In Sozopol, Bulgaria, archaeologists have uncovered multiple vampire burials, including one where a man was pinned to the ground with an iron sickle across his neck and his teeth removed. In Poland, a mass grave was found containing decapitated skeletons, some with padlocks on their toes, a symbolic gesture to keep the dead from walking. These weren't isolated incidents. Across Eastern Europe, people developed elaborate rituals to prevent the dead from returning. Suspected vampires were buried with mouths stuffed with bricks, heads turned backward, or bodies placed face down so they dig deeper into the earth if they tried to rise. In some cases, the heart was removed and burned, and the ashes scattered to the wind. It was a grim business, but to the villagers, it was a matter of survival. And the fear wasn't just about physical harm. Vampires were seen as spiritual threats, capable of corrupting the soul, spreading sin, and unraveling the fragile boundary between the living and the dead. They were the embodiment of unresolved trauma, social anxiety, and cosmic imbalance. A vampire in the village meant something had gone terribly wrong, morally, spiritually, or communally. Even the church, which officially condemned belief in vampires, often looked the other way. Priests were known to bless graves, perform exorcisms, or even participate in vampire hunts. Because when your parishioners are convinced that old man Stanislav is chewing on his burial shroud and causing the milk to curdle, you don't argue theology, you grab a shovel, and so the fear endured. Passed down through generations, whispered over fires, etched into the very soil of the land. It shaped burial practices, inspired legends, and left behind a trail of disturbed graves and iron-bound skeletons. Which brings us to the next line of defense in this grim folklore arsenal: using stakes, garlic, or iron to protect graves. In the folklore-soaked soil of Eastern Europe, and increasingly across medieval Europe at large, graveyards weren't just places of mourning. They were battlegrounds where the living fought to keep the dead from rising. And when it came to defending against revenants, vampires, or other restless spirits, people turned to a trio of time-honored tools: stakes, garlic, and iron. Let's start with the most iconic: the stake. Popularized by later vampire fiction, the idea of driving a wooden stake through a corpse's heart actually has deep historical roots. In regions like Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland, archaeologists have uncovered graves where skeletons were pinned to the earth with iron rods or wooden stakes, often through the chest, abdomen, or even the legs. The purpose: to nail the spirit in place, ensuring it couldn't rise and wander. In some cases, the stake was driven through the mouth, especially if the deceased was suspected of being a chewer, a corpse believed to gnaw on its burial shroud and thereby spread disease. The type of wood mattered too. Ash, hawthorn, and oak were favored for their supposed spiritual potency. Ash was associated with protection, hawthorn with purity, and oak with strength. The stake wasn't just a weapon. It was a ritual tool, often blessed or carved with symbols before being used. Then there was garlic, the pungent pantry staple turned supernatural repellent. Garlic was believed to ward off evil spirits, demons, and especially vampires. In some traditions, cloves were placed in the mouth of the corpse, stuffed into the nostrils, or sewn into the burial shroud. Others hung garlic braids over graves or planted garlic around the perimeter like a fragrant force field. The logic: garlic's strong smell and association with purity would repel anything unholy. Plus, if the vampire did rise, at least it would smell like dinner. And finally, iron, the metal of choice for spiritual warfare. Iron was believed to have inherent magical properties, capable of repelling witches, fairies, and the undead. It was cold, hard, and forged in fire. Everything a ghost supposedly hated. People buried the dead with iron nails, scythers, or horseshoes. Some graves were even covered with iron cages, known as mortsefes, which were originally designed to deter body snatchers, but also served as a handy anti-vampire measure. In Poland, several vampire graves have been found with iron sickles laid across the neck or abdomen of the corpse. The idea was that if the body tried to rise, it would be decapitated or disemboweled in the process. One particularly dramatic burial included a padlock on the toe, symbolically locking the spirit in place. It's the kind of detail that makes you wonder whether the villagers were terrified or just very thorough. These practices weren't just about superstition. They were about control, fear, and ritual. In a world where death was ever present and poorly understood, people did what they could to protect themselves. And if that meant turning a grave into a booby-trapped bunker, so be it. But not all magical defenses were reactive. Some were offensive, designed to harm or kill from afar. And few stories capture that dark ambition better than the tale of a 14th century magician who tried to assassinate a king using wax figures and curses. Stories of John of Nottingham and wax figure curses. In the annals of medieval English sorcery, few tales are as chilling and oddly bureaucratic as that of John of Nottingham, a 14th century magician who allegedly tried to assassinate King Edward Thai and his inner circle using wax effigies and necromantic rituals. This wasn't some whispered village curse or a love potion gone wrong. This was full-blown political sorcery, complete with contracts, conspirators, and a test run on an unfortunate local named Richard de Lowe. The story begins in 1323, in the city of Coventry, where tensions were boiling over. The citizens were fed up with the Prior of Coventry, who had been extracting heavy taxes with the backing of the king's notorious favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Edward, his rule had grown increasingly despotic, and resentment was thick enough to cut with a consecrated dagger. A group of 28 disgruntled citizens decided they'd had enough, and they wanted to strike back in the most medievally dramatic way possible. Hire a magician to kill the king with magic. Enter John of Nottingham, a reputed necromancer and practitioner of the dark arts. He was approached by the conspirators and allegedly paid £20, a princely sum at the time, to carry out the deed. His assistant, Robert Marshall, received £15. Their mission: to eliminate King Edward II, Hugh Despenser the Younger, Hugh Despenser the Elder, and the Prior of Coventry, along with a few of the Prior's particularly loathed staff members. John got to work in a deserted house outside Coventry, where he and Marshall began crafting wax effigies of their targets. Using 7 pounds of wax and 2 yards of cloth, they moulded the likenesses of the king, the Despensers, the Prior, and others. But before launching a full magical assault on the monarchy, John decided to test his methods on a local man named Richard de Lowe, or de Sow, depending on the source, a sort of magical guinea pig. On April 27, 1324, John performed the ritual. He drove a lead pin into the forehead of de Lowe's effigy. According to witnesses, de Lowe immediately began to suffer, crying out in agony and losing his senses. Weeks later, the pin was moved to the effigy's heart, and de Lowe died shortly thereafter. The implication was clear: the magic worked. But then came the twist. John's assistant, Robert Marshall, turned him in, possibly out of guilt, fear, or a personal grudge. The case was brought before the king's bench, and the conspirators were tried for the murder of de Lowe. Despite the dramatic evidence and the very real corpse, the jury found them not guilty. Whether this was due to lack of hard proof, fear of implicating powerful figures, or sheer disbelief in the power of wax dolls, we'll never know. The fallout, however, was very real. Hugh Despenser, already paranoid, became deeply alarmed. He even wrote to Pope John XI, begging for spiritual protection against magical attacks. The Pope's response: essentially, repent, confess, and stop being terrible. That's your protection. No indulgences, no relics, just a divine side, and a reminder to behave. The tale of John of Nottingham is remarkable, not just for its drama, but for what it reveals about the intersection of politics, magic, and fear in medieval England. It was one of the earliest recorded cases of witchcraft, used as political assassination, and it set the stage for centuries of paranoia about sorcery, treason, and the power of the unseen. But while John's tale is rooted in political rebellion, another legend from medieval England takes us deep into the realm of moral allegory and supernatural punishment. A tale of sin, death, and a final ride into darkness. Next up, the chilling legend of the Witch of Berkeley. In the shadowed folds of medieval English folklore, few tales are as haunting, or as theatrically infernal, as the legend of the Witch of Berkeley. First recorded by the 12th century monk William of Malmesbury in his Gesta Regum Anglorum. This story wasn't just a fireside fright. It was a moral allegory, a cautionary tale wrapped in brimstone and bound with chains. The tale begins in the quiet town of Berkeley, nestled in Gloucestershire, where a wealthy woman lived in comfort and notoriety. She was no ordinary matron. According to William, she was addicted to witchcraft, skilled in augury, divination by birds, and had amassed her fortune through demonic arts. She was described as gluttonous, lascivious, and utterly unrepentant, a woman who had indulged in every vice and dallied with every temptation. In short, she was the medieval equivalent of a tabloid headline. But even witches grow old. As her health declined, the woman received a terrible omen. A jackdaw, an ominous bird in medieval superstition, began shrieking louder than usual. Moments later, a messenger arrived with devastating news: her son and his entire family had died in a tragic accident. The witch, realizing her time was near, panicked. She summoned her 2 surviving children, a monk and a nun, and confessed everything. She told them that because of her pacts with evil spirits, her soul was forfeit. But she begged them to protect her body after death, to prevent the devils from claiming it. Her instructions were bizarre and specific. Sew her corpse into the skin of a stag, a creature believed to repel evil. Place her body in a stone sarcophagus, sealed with 3 massive iron chains. Keep vigil over her body for 3 nights in the church, and only then bury her. Her children, horrified but obedient, did exactly as she asked. The body was sewn, chained, and placed in the church. On the first night, the ground trembled and a demonic voice echoed through the nave. A black figure appeared, broke the first chain, and vanished. The monk and nun, terrified, prayed harder. On the second night, the same thing happened. The second chain snapped like thread. The siblings, now pale as altar candles, clung to their faith and each other. But on the third night, all hell broke loose, literally. A massive demon, described as horrendous in appearance, burst into the church. It shattered the final chain, ripped open the coffin, and dragged the woman's body out. Her screams echoed through the church as the demon mounted a black horse with iron hooves and rode off into the night, the witch's body slung across the saddle like a sack of sin. The next morning, all that remained were deep claw marks on the stone floor, and the lingering stench of sulphur and damnation. William of Malmesbury didn't tell this tale just to scare his readers, though it certainly did that. He placed it immediately after the story of Pope Gregory VIII, a man whose body was miraculously welcomed into a church by divine wind. The contrast was deliberate. Gregory, the saint, was embraced by God. The witch, the sinner, was expelled by devils. It was a stark reminder of what awaited those who turned from the church and dabbled in forbidden arts. But the witch of Berkeley's story didn't end with her fiery abduction. It echoed through the centuries, inspiring ballads, sermons, and even 19th century illustrations. Her tale became a template for demonic punishment, a vivid example of what could happen if you made deals with dark forces and forgot to read the fine print. And yet, for all its horror, the story also fed into a growing fascination with magic, prophecy, and the supernatural. If witches could summon demons and fly off into the night, what else might be possible? Could there be magic that wasn't evil? Could there be wizards who used their powers for good? Enter the most famous wizard of them all, a figure who straddled the line between myth and history, between druid and prophet, between man and myth. Merlin legends feeding medieval beliefs about wizards. In the vast constellation of medieval myth and magic, no figure burned brighter or cast a longer shadow than Merlin, the enigmatic wizard of Arthurian legend. He wasn't just a character in a story. He was the template for what a wizard could be: wise, mysterious, powerful, and just a little bit terrifying. His legend didn't merely entertain. It shaped how medieval people thought about magic, prophecy, and the strange, grey space between divine inspiration and dangerous sorcery. Merlin's story is a patchwork of older traditions, stitched together by medieval chroniclers, poets, and monks who couldn't resist a good tale. His earliest roots lie in Welsh mythology, particularly in the figure of Myrddin Welt, a wild prophet driven mad by war who fled into the forest and gained the gift of foresight. This Myrddin was a tragic, poetic figure, part druid, part madman, part seer. But when Geoffrey of Monmouth got hold of him in the 12th century, things got theatrical. In Geoffrey's Historia Regum Britannia, Merlin becomes Merlin Ambrosius, a boy born of a mortal woman, and a demon, yes, a literal demon, which explained his supernatural powers. He's introduced as a child prophet, who astounds King Vortigern's court by revealing that two dragons are fighting beneath a collapsing tower, one red, one white, symbolizing the struggle between the Britons and the Saxons. From there, Merlin's legend only grows. He becomes the advisor to Uther Pendragon, arranges the conception of King Arthur, and later serves as Arthur's chief counselor, magical engineer, and occasional babysitter. But Merlin wasn't just a wizard who waved his hands and made things happen. He was a prophet, a shapeshifter, a master of illusion, and a keeper of ancient knowledge. He was said to have built Stonehenge using giant stones, to have conjured the sword in the stone, and to have foreseen the fall of Camelot. His powers were vast, but his morality was murky. He was a liminal figure, half Christian, half pagan, half saint, half sorcerer. And that ambiguity made him irresistible to medieval audiences. As the Arthurian legends evolved, so did Merlin. In the Vulgate cycle, he becomes more overtly magical, more entangled with the Holy Grail, and more tragic. His downfall comes at the hands of Nimue, the Lady of the Lake, who learns his secrets and traps him. Sometimes in a cave, sometimes in a tree, sometimes in a crystal tomb. The message was clear. Even the greatest wizard could be undone by love, pride, or simply trusting the wrong enchantress. But Merlin's influence didn't stop at literature. His legend blurred into real life, shaping how people in the Middle Ages understood magic and those who practiced it. He became the archetype of the wizard, the long bearded sage with a staff, a book of secrets, and a 1,000-yard stare. He was cited in grimoires, invoked in magical rituals, and even referenced in legal documents as proof that magic could be used for good, or at least for royal convenience. In some circles, Merlin was seen as a Christian prophet, a man whose powers came from God, despite his demonic parentage. In others, he was a dangerous sorcerer, a cautionary tale about the perils of forbidden knowledge. Either way, he was real enough to be feared, admired, and occasionally blamed when things went sideways, and his legacy endured. Long after the fall of Camelot, long after the last knight hung up his sword, Merlin lived on in folk tales, ballads, and whispered stories. He became the blueprint for every wizard to follow. Gandalf, Dumbledore, and every bearded man in a robe who ever muttered something cryptic and vanished in a puff of smoke. But while Merlin's magic was grand and noble, the magic of the common folk was earthier, wilder, and far more personal. In villages across Europe, people told stories of witches who didn't need staffs or prophecies. Just a dark night, a whispered spell, and the ability to become something else. In the winding lanes and fog-draped fields of medieval Europe, especially in the British Isles and Eastern Europe, villagers whispered of witches who could shed their human skin and become beasts. These weren't just idle tales told to frighten children. They were deeply rooted in folk belief, court testimony, and generational memory, passed down like heirlooms embroidered with fear. The most common transformation: the hare. In England, Scotland, and parts of Scandinavia, it was widely believed that witches could become hares to steal milk from cows, ruin crops, or attend sabbats under the cover of night. Hares were fast, elusive, and eerily silent, perfect forms for slipping through hedgerows and vanishing into the mist. In some tales, a farmer would shoot a hare in the leg, only to find the next morning that his neighbour, a woman long suspected of witchcraft, was limping and bloodied in the same spot. In North Yorkshire, a woman named Nancy Newgill was said to have transformed into a hedgehog to sneak into barns and suckle milk from cows. When a villager kicked the hedgehog in frustration, Nancy was found the next day bruised and limping, her secret exposed. In Lincolnshire, witches were believed to take the form of rats, toads, or magpies, often to spy on neighbours or sabotage their food stores. But the transformations weren't limited to small, sneaky creatures. In Norwegian and Icelandic folklore, witches were said to become whales, using their massive forms to sink ships and drown sailors. In Wales and Ireland, they might become black dogs, crows, or cats, slipping between worlds and watching from rooftops with glowing eyes. One 13th century chronicler, Gervase of Tilbury, recorded tales of women wounded while in the form of cats, only to be found the next day with matching injuries in human form. These stories weren't just metaphor. They were evidence in witch trials. In some 16th and 17th century court records, villagers testified that they had seen a woman transform into a hare, or that a black cat had spoken to them, only to vanish when struck. The line between hallucination folklore and legal testimony was perilously thin. In one case, a woman was accused of turning into a sheet, yes, a literal sheet, draped over a hedge to frighten travellers. One can only imagine the judge's face during that testimony. The mechanics of transformation varied. Some witches were said to use ointments or salves, made from herbs, animal fat, and whispered incantations. Others simply spoke a charm, often in rhyme, and vanished into their new form. The Scottish witch Isabel Gowdy, during her 1662 confession, recited detailed transformation spells, including, "I shall go into a hare, with sorrow and sigh and mickle care." She claimed she could become a hare, a cat, or even a crow, and that she and her coven would race across the fields to meet the devil himself. But why animals? Because animals were liminal beings, neither fully wild nor fully tame, neither wholly good nor wholly evil. They lived on the edges of human society, just like witches were believed to. A cat could be a pet or a predator. A toad could be harmless or poisonous. A hare could be prey or a thief. These creatures embodied the ambiguity and fear that surrounded witchcraft itself. And the fear was real. In some villages, if a hare was seen near a dairy and the milk soared the next day, it was assumed to be a witch. If a black dog howled at night and someone fell ill the next morning, the connection was made. People shot at animals, set traps, and even burned them, hoping to catch the witch in her other skin. Yet, for all the terror, there was also a strange respect. These witches were feared, yes, but also admired for their cunning, their freedom, their ability to slip the bonds of flesh and become something more, something wild. But not everyone was content to let these beliefs run wild. As tales of shape-shifting witches spread, the church found itself in a difficult position, caught between condemning superstition and quietly using its own arsenal of rituals and relics to battle the very forces it claimed didn't exist. Which leads us to the next chapter in this tangled tale, church battling superstition, but using exorcisms and relics. In the grand theatre of medieval Europe, the church stood as both the arbiter of truth and the reluctant referee of superstition. It condemned magical thinking from the pulpit, yet often wielded its own arsenal of rituals, relics, and rites that, let's be honest, looked suspiciously like the very practices it sought to suppress. This wasn't hypocrisy so much as a delicate dance. The church had to maintain spiritual authority in a world where people believed deeply in curses, demons, and the power of a well-placed charm. Let's start with exorcisms. Officially, the church taught that demons were real, possession was possible, An exorcism was a sacred rite, not a superstition. The Rituale Romanum, the Church's official manual for exorcists, first compiled in 1614, but based on older traditions, laid out precise instructions, prayers, holy water, crucifixes, and the invocation of Christ's name. The goal was to liberate the afflicted, not to entertain the masses. But to the average medieval villager, an exorcism looked a lot like magic, complete with chanting, ritual gestures, and dramatic confrontations with invisible forces. And the Church knew it. That's why exorcisms were often performed in secret, away from crowds, to avoid feeding the very superstitions the Church was trying to curb. Yet when demand surged, especially during outbreaks of plague, famine, or mass hysteria, priests were called in to perform exorcisms on people, homes, livestock, and even entire villages. In some cases, the afflicted were tied down, doused in holy water, and subjected to hours of prayer and shouting. If the demon left, it was a miracle. If it didn't, well, perhaps more fasting was needed. Then there were the relics, bones of saints, scraps of clothing, drops of blood, and even entire body parts preserved in ornate reliquaries. The Church insisted that relics were objects of veneration, not magical talismans. They were meant to inspire faith, not grant wishes. But let's be honest, to the faithful, relics were powerful tools. People believed they could heal the sick, protect against storms, ward off demons, and even resurrect the dead, in very rare and highly unofficial cases. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles to touch a saint's femur or kiss a vial of holy blood. Relics were paraded through towns during plagues, held aloft during battles, and placed in cribs to protect newborns. Some churches even competed over who had the most potent relics, because nothing says divine favor like a toe bone that glows in the dark. The Church tried to regulate this fervor. It issued edicts against fake relics, unauthorized exorcisms, and folk rituals masquerading as Christian rites. But enforcement was tricky. In many rural areas, the local priest was the only spiritual authority, and he often had to walk a fine line between doctrine and the deeply rooted beliefs of his flock. This tension came to a head in the Church's relationship with folk magic. On one hand, priests condemned it as pagan, heretical, and dangerous. On the other, they often participated in it, albeit with a few theological tweaks. After all, when your parishioners are begging you to bless their fields, protect their cows, and stop the neighbor's evil eye, you don't quote canon law. You grab your stole and get to work. Which brings us to the next chapter in this curious coexistence. Priests condemning folk magic while blessing fields and livestock. In the patchwork of medieval life, where the sacred and the superstitious were stitched tightly together, few figures walked a tighter rope than the village priest. He was the shepherd of souls, the voice of the Church, the keeper of sacraments. And yet, he was also the man villagers turned to when their cows stopped giving milk, their wheat turned sour, or their neighbors gave them the evil eye. And so, the priest found himself in a curious position, publicly condemning folk magic, while quietly performing rituals that looked suspiciously like it. The Church's official stance was clear: magic was heresy, a dangerous flirtation with the demonic. The Canon Episcopi, a 10th century church text, denounced belief in witches and magical flight as delusions planted by the devil. Later church councils and inquisitors would double down, branding all forms of sorcery, no matter how well-intentioned, as spiritually treasonous. But in the muddy lanes of rural Europe, things were far less black and white. Take, for example, the blessing of fields. Every spring, priests would lead processions through the countryside, chanting prayers, sprinkling holy water, and invoking divine protection over the crops. This ritual, known as the Rogation Days, was meant to ensure a bountiful harvest and ward off storms, pests, and blight. But to the average peasant, it looked an awful lot like a magical charm, especially when the priest waved a cross over the soil and muttered Latin incantations while walking in a circle. And then there were the livestock blessings. On feast days like St. Anthony's Day or St. Blaise's Day, villagers would bring their animals to the churchyard to be blessed. The priest would sprinkle them with holy water, recite protective prayers, and sometimes even tie blessed herbs or ribbons to their horns or tails. These rituals were meant to protect against disease, theft, and infertility. Again, the line between sacrament and spell was razor thin. In some regions, priests were even asked to bless butter churns, ploughs, or beehives, objects deeply tied to survival and prosperity. And while the church might have frowned on a farmer burying a charm under his barn, it had no problem with him nailing a crucifix to the door or burying a relic of a saint in the field. The symbols changed, but the intent remained the same: to harness supernatural power for protection and success. This uneasy coexistence extended to healing rituals as well. While the church condemned cunning folk and herbalists who used charms or incantations, it often tolerated, or even encouraged, priests who did the same, as long as they invoked God, saints, or scripture. A priest might lay hands on the sick, recite a psalm, and anoint them with oil, actions that mirrored folk healing, but were cloaked in ecclesiastical legitimacy. The tension was especially palpable in border regions, where pagan traditions still lingered. In parts of Scandinavia, the Baltic, and the British Isles, priests found themselves competing with local wise women and charmers for spiritual authority. Some tried to stamp out these practices with fire and brimstone. Others co-opted them, blending Christian and folk elements into a hybrid faith that was more palatable to the people. And yet, the church never fully embraced this syncretism. It continued to issue edicts against amulets, charms, and superstitious rites, even as its own clergy performed rituals that looked suspiciously similar. The result was a kind of spiritual doublethink. Magic was evil, unless it was performed by a priest with the right words and the right vestments. This ambiguity would come to a head in the witch trials of the late medieval and early modern periods, when courts began to draw sharp lines between white magic, healing, protection, blessing, and black magic's harm, cursing, demonic pacts. But even then, the definitions were slippery, and the consequences could be deadly. Which brings us to the next chapter in this tangled tale of belief and fear differentiating white, ves, black magic in trials. As witch trials intensified across Europe between the 15th and 17th centuries, inquisitors and secular courts began to draw distinctions between different types of magical practice, most notably between so-called white magic and black magic. This differentiation was not always consistent, but it reflected a growing attempt to categorize and morally evaluate the intent and perceived effects of magical acts. White magic, often referred to as natural or beneficial magic, was typically associated with healing, protection, and divination. Practitioners of white magic, sometimes called cunning folk, wise women, or folk healers, used herbs, charms, and prayers to cure illnesses, bless crops, or ward off evil. In many communities, these individuals were respected and relied upon, especially in rural areas where access to formal medicine or clergy was limited. Their rituals often blended Christian elements with older pagan traditions, invoking saints alongside seasonal rites or astrological timing. Black magic, by contrast, was defined by its malicious intent. It included acts such as cursing, conjuring demons, causing illness or death, and manipulating others against their will. Accusations of black magic were far more likely to result in prosecution and execution, as they were seen as direct threats to both the social order and divine law. Black magic was often linked to diabolical pacts, sabbats, and heresy, and those accused of it were believed to be in league with the devil. However, the line between white and black magic was perilously thin. A healing charm could be reinterpreted as a curse if the patient worsened. A love spell, though seemingly benign, could be seen as coercive and thus morally suspect. Even protective amulets could be viewed as superstitious or idolatrous. The intent behind the act, the outcome, and the social standing of the practitioner all influenced how the magic was judged. In many trials, especially in regions like Germany, France, and Scotland, courts began to scrutinize even white magic. The logic was that all magic invoked supernatural forces, and if those forces were not explicitly divine, they were presumed to be demonic. This shift reflected the growing influence of demonological literature, such as the Malleus Maleficarum, which argued that any deviation from orthodox Christian practice was inherently dangerous. Some inquisitors and theologians attempted to codify the difference. They argued that white magic sought to align with natural law and divine will, while black magic sought to subvert it. But in practice, these distinctions were often ignored or collapsed under the weight of fear, suspicion, and political expediency. A midwife who used herbs to ease childbirth might be praised in one village and burned in another. The ambiguity surrounding magical categories also reflected broader tensions in European thought. As the Renaissance unfolded, new ideas about natural philosophy, empirical observation, and human agency began to challenge older frameworks of belief. Magic, once seen as a tool for understanding and influencing the world, was increasingly marginalized as irrational or heretical. This intellectual shift would soon find a new home in the emerging institutions of higher learning. As universities expanded and classical texts were rediscovered, a new emphasis on reason, observation, and systematic inquiry began to take root, laying the groundwork for a profound transformation in how knowledge was defined and pursued. Next, rise of universities spreading scientific thought. The rise of universities in medieval and early modern Europe marked a profound shift in how knowledge was created, preserved, and transmitted. While monasteries and cathedral schools had long been centers of learning, the emergence of universities as formal institutions in the 12th and 13th centuries, such as Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, laid the groundwork for a new intellectual culture that would eventually challenge superstition, dogma, and magical thinking. At their core, these universities were designed to systematize knowledge. They offered structured curricula in the triviums, grammar, rhetoric, logic, and quadrivium arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, and later expanded into law, medicine, and theology. While theology remained dominant, the inclusion of natural philosophy, what we now call science, created space for inquiry into the workings of the natural world. By the 14th century, scholars began to re-examine classical texts by Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy, often through the lens of Islamic and Jewish commentators, like Avicenna and Maimonides. This reintroduction of ancient knowledge, combined with scholastic methods of debate and dialectic, encouraged critical thinking and empirical observation, even within a religious framework. The scientific thought that emerged from universities was still deeply entangled with theology, but it began to ask new questions. What are the laws of motion? How does the human body function? What is the structure of the cosmos? Figures like Roger Bacon, a 13th century Franciscan friar, advocated for experimental science and observation, arguing that knowledge should be grounded in experience rather than authority. By the 15th and 16th centuries, universities became hubs of innovation, especially in Italy, Germany, and the Low Countries. The rise of humanism during the Renaissance further encouraged scholars to study nature, mathematics, and the human body with fresh eyes. Anatomy lectures, astronomical observations, and mathematical modeling became increasingly common. The groundwork was being laid for the scientific revolution. Importantly, universities also began to standardize knowledge. Through lectures, disputations, and written texts, they created a shared intellectual culture that could be transmitted across generations and borders. This helped displace local superstitions and folk beliefs with more systematic explanations of natural phenomena. Still, access to this knowledge was limited. Latin remained the language of instruction, and books were rare and expensive. Ideas spread slowly, and superstition remained deeply rooted in rural communities. But that was about to change dramatically, because in the mid-15th century, a German goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg introduced a technology that would revolutionize the spread of knowledge and, over time, erode the foundations of superstition. Next, printing press, reducing superstition slowly. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450 marked a seismic shift in the intellectual and cultural landscape of Europe, though its immediate effects were not uniformly rational or progressive. Indeed, it initially helped spread witch hunting manuals and apocalyptic prophecies. It ultimately played a crucial role in dismantling superstition and laying the groundwork for a more informed and skeptical society. Before the printing press, books were rare, expensive, and handwritten, typically by monks in monasteries. Knowledge was controlled by a small elite, and oral tradition, often steeped in folklore, myth, and magical thinking, remained the dominant mode of transmission for most people. The printing press democratized access to information, allowing ideas to circulate more widely, more quickly, and more accurately than ever before. At first, this new technology amplified superstition. One of the earliest bestsellers was the Malleus Maleficarum, c. 1487, a witch hunting manual that codified fears about sorcery and demonic pacts. Its widespread availability helped fuel the witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries. But over time, the same press that spread fear also spread its antidote: education, critical thinking, and scientific inquiry. By the early 16th century, humanist scholars began using the press to publish classical texts, philosophical treatises, and scientific works. The writings of Erasmus, Copernicus, and later Galileo reached audiences far beyond the universities. These texts challenged traditional cosmologies, questioned church authority, and encouraged readers to observe, reason, and doubt. The printing press also enabled the rise of vernacular literature, books written in local languages rather than Latin. This allowed ordinary people to read religious texts, medical guides, and almanacs for themselves. As literacy spread, so did the ability to compare claims, verify facts, and reject superstition. People no longer had to rely solely on the word of priests, charmers, or traveling storytellers. By the 17th century, printed materials began to debunk magical thinking. Pamphlets and broadsheets ridiculed astrologers, exposed fraudulent healers, and promoted natural explanations for disease and disaster. The rise of scientific journals and encyclopedias in the 18th century further marginalized magical worldviews, replacing them with empirical knowledge and rational discourse. Still, the process was gradual and uneven. In rural areas, where literacy remained low and printed materials scarce, folk beliefs persisted well into the modern era. But in urban centers and among the educated classes, the printing press helped shift the cultural tide. Superstition was no longer the default lens through which people viewed the world. It became something to be questioned, studied, or even mocked. And yet magic did not vanish, it transformed. As formal belief in sorcery declined, magical motifs found a new home, not in grimoires or court records, but in folklore, storytelling, and cultural memory. Next, magic blending into folklore by the end of the medieval period. By the close of the medieval era, magic, once feared, prosecuted, and debated in theological treatises, had begun to dissolve into the fabric of folklore, becoming less a matter of heresy and more a matter of heritage. This transformation didn't happen overnight, nor was it uniform across Europe, but as the intellectual, religious, and social landscapes shifted, so too did the place of magic in the collective imagination. In earlier centuries, magic had been a charged category, often associated with heresy, demonic pacts, and social deviance. But by the 15th century, especially in rural communities, many magical practices had become domesticated, woven into the rhythms of daily life, seasonal rituals, and oral storytelling. The cunning folk, herbalists, and midwives, who once risked suspicion for their knowledge of charms and remedies, were increasingly seen as custodians of tradition, not threats to orthodoxy. This shift was partly due to the growing influence of Christianity, which had over centuries absorbed and reinterpreted many pagan and magical customs. Seasonal festivals were rebranded as saints' days. Protective charms were replaced, or at least supplemented, by crosses, relics, and prayers. Yet the underlying logic of magic, that unseen forces could be influenced through ritual, symbol, and intention, remained intact. Folk tales from this period reflect this blending. Witches, once feared as real, world threats, became figures of cautionary legend. Old women who lived in the woods, brewed potions, and occasionally turned into animals. Magic was no longer just a tool of the wicked. It was a narrative device, a way to explain the inexplicable, and to teach moral lessons. A child who disobeyed might be spirited away by a fairy. A greedy merchant might be cursed by a beggar in disguise. These stories didn't require belief in literal magic. They required belief in consequence, mystery, and the moral order of the world. Even the material culture of magic began to change. Amulets, once feared as signs of sorcery, became folk relics, tokens of protection passed down through families. Magical symbols were carved into doorways, baked into bread, or embroidered into clothing. They were no longer seen as dangerous. They were cultural memory, encoded in gesture and superstition. This transformation was also influenced by the rise of literacy and print culture. As books became more accessible, magical knowledge, once confined to grimoires and whispered traditions, was increasingly recorded, categorized, and fictionalized. Magic became a subject of curiosity, not just condemnation. It was something to be studied, collected, and eventually romanticized. By the end of the medieval period, magic had become folklore, a repository of communal fears, hopes, and wisdom. It no longer belonged solely to the accused or the condemned. It belonged to everyone: the storyteller, the grandmother, the child afraid of the dark. But this softening of magic's image did not mean the end of persecution. In fact, as Europe entered the early modern era, a new wave of fear and fanaticism would rise, one that would turn the fading embers of medieval superstition into the raging fires of the witch hunts. Next, witch hunts shifting to the early modern era. As Europe transitioned from the medieval to the early modern period, the nature and intensity of witch hunts underwent a dramatic transformation. What had once been sporadic accusations rooted in local superstition evolved into systematic, state-sanctioned campaigns of persecution. Between roughly 1450 and 1750, an estimated 100,000 people were tried for witchcraft, with 40,000 to 60,000 executed, the vast majority of them women. This escalation was not the result of a single cause, but rather a convergence of social, religious, legal, and intellectual shifts that created a perfect storm of fear and fervor. Religious upheaval and the devil's new role, the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic counter. Reformation fractured the religious unity of Europe, and intensified anxieties about spiritual purity. Both sides of the confessional divide began to emphasize the reality of the devil's presence in the world. Witchcraft was no longer seen as mere superstition or misguided folk practice. It was reframed as a heretical pact with Satan, a direct threat to the moral and theological order. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican inquisitor, was a watershed moment. This text argued that witches were not only real, but dangerously subversive, and that their crimes, ranging from weather manipulation to infanticide, were enabled by demonic powers. The Malleus provided a legal and theological framework for identifying, interrogating, and executing witches, and it was widely disseminated thanks to the printing press, legal systems, and the machinery of persecution. The early modern period saw the centralization of legal authority, which paradoxically made witch trials both more organized and more brutal. Inquisitorial procedures allowed for anonymous accusations, torture to extract confessions, and presumptions of guilt. In regions like the Holy Roman Empire, where local magistrates had broad autonomy, witch hunts could spiral into mass panics. Entire villages were swept up in accusations, with neighbors turning on one another under pressure or suspicion. The gendered nature of these trials also became more pronounced. Roughly 80% of those accused were women, often older, widowed, or socially marginalized. Misfortunes like crop failure, illness, or infant mortality were frequently blamed on women, who were seen as other. Those who lived alone, practiced healing, or simply didn't conform to expected roles. Social and economic stresses, periods of famine, war, and plague often coincided with spikes in witch trials. In times of crisis, communities sought scapegoats to explain suffering and misfortune. Witchcraft provided a convenient narrative. If your child died or your cow stopped producing milk, it wasn't random. It was the result of malicious intent. This logic, though flawed, offered a sense of control in a chaotic world. Decline and skepticism. By the late 17th century, skepticism began to take root. High-profile cases, such as the Salem witch trials in 1692 or the Pendle trials in England, sparked public debate and criticism. Enlightenment thinkers like Reginald Scott, Johann Weyer, and later Voltaire began to challenge the logic of witchcraft accusations, arguing that they were based on fear, misogyny, and flawed reasoning. Legal reforms followed. Torture was curtailed, evidentiary standards were raised, and the burden of proof shifted. By the early 18th century, witch trials had largely ceased in Western Europe, though isolated cases continued in Eastern Europe and colonial territories. Yet even as the trials faded, the memory of magic endured. It lingered in stories, in customs, in the quiet rituals of daily life. Because for centuries, magic had not been a fringe belief. It had been woven into the very fabric of reality. Magic was in the amulet worn around the neck, the herbs hung above the door, the words muttered under the breath. It was in the blessing of the fields, the curse spat in anger, the dream interpreted by the old woman at the edge of the village. It was in the bones of saints, the wax figures hidden in cellars, the stars charted by candlelight. It was in the fear of the witch, the reverence for the cunning man, the awe of the relic, the ritual of the exorcism. It was in the trial by fire, the confession under torture, the execution at dawn. It was in the stories told by firelight, the songs sung at harvest, the legends passed from mouth to ear for generations. In the medieval world, magic was not a genre. It was not a metaphor. It was not a superstition to be mocked from the safety of modernity. It was as real as rain and death. Disclaimer: while we've done our best to stay true to historical sources, the medieval world was a messy, contradictory place, and so are the records it left behind. Some details may be debated, disputed, or delightfully dubious. If you spot a mistake, Blame the scribe who copied this by candlelight in the 14th century. You've reached the end of the narration! If you enjoyed this long, winding journey through medieval magic, subscribe for more tales of history, mystery, and the occasional demonic horse. Drop a comment below. Tell us your favorite part, or confess which relic you'd smuggle out of a cathedral. And if you were listening to this to help you fall asleep, well, God help you, because you just stayed awake through centuries of curses, saints, and spectral livestock. Now close your eyes, dream of glowing amulets and whispering forests, and remember, if you hear hoofbeats at midnight, it's probably just a demon on a black horse dragging a witch to hell. Sweet dreams.